Hey, welcome back, everybody. I'm Evil Mike, or Mike if you prefer. And this is going to be my part 3 in Deceiving Kings, the Gunslinger Revised Edition. For those of you that are following along, we are on chapter 3. That's going to be page 124. I'm going to say hello to everybody, and then I'm going to get into it. First up, we had Las Cruces in here, but it took away his comment. But I'll get you tagged. We got Robin. What's up, Robin? Take a bath, but you can, okay, I like that. I'll be in the bathtub with you. All right. Thanks, Tina. And if y'all can't make it, no problem at all. This is an unscheduled. I'm just trying to get the book done. So the replay is perfect. There's Las Cruz. What's up, Las Cruz? What's up, James? All right, that is everybody. All right, so without further ado, I'll show you a couple little pictures that we got. We got Roland and his jawbone, and we got the noose with Hax that was in our last story, the Hax the cook. All right, chapter 3, the Oracle and the Mountains, subchapter 1. Hey, Carmen's Crafts, thanks for stopping by. The boy found the Oracle, and it almost destroyed him. Some thin instinct brought velvet darkness. I think I fell out for a second. Some thin instinct brought the gunslinger up from sleep to the velvet darkness which had fallen on them at dusk. They had been when he and Jake reached the grassy, nearly level oasis above the first rise of tumbled foothills. Even on the hard scrabble below, where they had toiled and fought for every foot in the killer sun, they had been able to hear the sound of crickets rubbing their legs seductively together in the perpetual green of willow groves above them. The gunslinger remained calm in his mind, and the boy had kept up at least the pretense of a facade. Whom that made the gunslinger proud. But Jake hadn't been able to hide the wilderness in his eyes, which were white and starry. The eyes of a horse, scented water, held back from bolting only by the tenuous chain of his master's mind, like a horse at the point where only understanding, not the spur, could hold it steady. The gunslinger could gauge the need in Jake by the madness, the sounds of the crickets bred in his own body. His arms seemed to seek out shell to scrape on, and his knees seemed to beg to be ripped in tiny, maddening, salty gashes. The sun trampled them all the way, even when he turned a swollen, feverish red with sunset. It shone perversely through the knife cut in the hills off to the left, blinding them and making every teardrop of sweat into a prism of pain. Then there was sawgrass, at first only yellow scrub, clinging with gruesome vitality to the bleak soil where the last of the runoff reached. Further up there was witchgrass, which first sparse, then green and rank, then the sweet smell of real grass, mixed with timothy and shaded by the first of the dwarfed firs. There the gunslinger saw in the arc of brown moving in the shadows. He drew, fired, for Jake, and began to cry out his surprise. A moment later he had reholstered the gun. 1 second. What's up, Bud Files? Here, the gunslinger said. Up ahead, the grass depending into a jungle of green willows that was shocking after the parched sterility of the endless hardpan. There would be a spring, perhaps several of them, and it would be even cooler. and it was better out here in the open. The boy had pushed every step he could push, and there might be sucker bats in the deeper shadows of the groove. The bats might break the boy's sleep, no matter how deep it was. And if they were vampires, neither of them might awaken, at least not in this world. The boy said, I can. The gunslinger smiled. No, you won't. Sit yourself, Jake. Whose phrase had that been? Some woman? Susan? He couldn't remember. T times the thief of memory. That one he knew. That one had been Vanny's. The boy sat. When the gunslinger got back, Jake was asleep in the grass. A large praying mantis was performing absolutions on the springy stem of the kid's cowlick. The gunslinger snorted laughter. The first in gods knew how long, and set the fire, went after water. The willow jungle was deeper than he had suspected and confusing in the falling light, but he had found a spring richly guarded by frogs and peepers. He filled one of the water skins and paused. The sounds that filled the night awoke in an uneasy, what is that? It's like broken sensuality in him, a feeling that not even Allie, the woman had bedded with in Toll, had been able to bring out. Too much of the time with Allie had been business. He chalked it up to a sudden blinding change from the desert. After all those miles of bleak heartpan, the softness of dark seemed nearly desiccant. He returned to the camp and skinned the rabbit while water boiled over the fire, mixed with the last of the canned veg. The rabbit made an excellent stew. He woke Jake and watched him as he ate, blearing but ravenous. We stay here tomorrow, the gunslinger said. But that man you're after, the priest. He's no priest, but don't worry, he'll keep. How do you know? The gunslinger could only shake his head. The intuition was strong in him, but it was not a good intuition. After the meal, he rinsed the cans from which they had eaten, marveling again at his own water extravagance, and when he turned around, Jake was asleep again. The gunslinger felt the non-familiar rising and falling in his chest that he could only identify with Cuthbert. Cuthbert had been Roland's own age, but he had seemed so much younger. His cigarette dropped towards the grass, and he tossed it into the fire. He looked at it, the clear yellow burn so different, so much clearer, cleaner from the way the devil grass burned. The air was wonderfully cool, and he lay down with his back to the fire. Far away through the gash that led the way into the mountains, he heard the thick mouth of perpetual thunder. He slept and dreamed. Subchapter 2, it's going to be page 126. Susan Delgado, his beloved, was dying before his eyes. He watched, his arms held by two villagers on each side, his neck dog caught in a huge, rusty iron collar. This wasn't the way it had happened. He hadn't even been there. But dreams had their own logic, didn't they? She was dying. He could smell her burning hair, could hear the cries of the coyote tree, and he could see the color of his own madness. Susan, a lovely girl at the window, horseman's daughter. How she had fled across the drop. Her shadow, that of a horse, and a girl merged, a fabulous creature, out of an old story, something wild and free. How they had flown together in the corn. Now they were flinging corn shucks at her, and husks caught fire even before they had caught in her hair. The chayu tree, the chayu tree, they cried. These enemies of light and love, somewhere the witch was cackling. Rhea, the witch's name had been. Susan was turning black in the flames. Her skin cracked open. And what was calling? What was she calling? The boy. She was screaming, Roland, the boy. He whirled, pulling his captors from him. The collar ripped at his neck, and he heard the hitching, strangling sounds that were coming from his own throat. There was a sickish, sweet smell of barbecuing meat on the air. The boy was looking down at him from a window high above the funeral pyre, the same window where Susan, who had taught him to be a man, had once sat and sung the old songs, Hey Jude, and Easy on Down the Road, and Careless Love. He looked out from the window like the statue of an alabaster saint in a cathedral. His eyes were marble. A spike had been driven through Jake's forehead. The gunslinger felt the strangling, ripping scream The salionated the beginning of the lunacy pulled from the bottom of his belly. No. Subchapter 3, page 127. Give me 1 second. What's up, Trev? I'm happy to hear that, man. He just finished the book. He's been reading the first book himself. 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. And anybody new or watching this on the rewind, I will be taking breaks, not scheduled or whatever. Just, when I do reach a new chapter or subchapter, just so I can take a drink and go to the bathroom, hit my vape, those kind of things. Okay, so back to work. We are at subchapter 3, page 127. Roland grunted a cry as he felt the fire singe him. He had sat bolt right up in the dark, still feeling the dream of mages around him, strangling him like the collar he had worn. In his twistings and turnings, he had thrown one hand against the dying coals of the fire. He had put that hand to his face, feeling the dream flee, leaving only the stark picture of Jake, plaster white, a saint for demons. Ugh. He glared around at the mystic darkness of the willow grove, both guns out and ready. His eyes were red loopholes in the last glow from the fire. Ugh! Jake! The gunslinger was up on the run. A bitter circle of moon had risen, and he could follow the boy's tracks in the dew. He ducked under the first of the willows, splashed through the spring, and legged up the far bank, siding in the dampness. Even now his body could relish it. Willow, wise, slapped at his face. The trees were thicker here, and the moon was blotted out. Tree trunks rose in lurching shadows. The grass, now knee-high, caressed him, as if pleading him to slow down, to enjoy the cool, to enjoy the life. Half-rotted dead branches reached for his shins, his cojones. He passed for a moment, lifting his head and scented at the air. A ghost of a breeze helped him. The boy did not smell good, of course. Neither of them did. The gunslinger's nostrils flared like those of an ape. The younger, lighter odor of the boy's sweat was faint, oily, and unmistakable. He crashed over a deadfall of grass and bramble and downed branches, sprinting through a tunnel of overhanging willow and sumac. Moss struck his shoulders like flabby corpse hands, some cling in siding's gray tendrils. He clawed through a last barricade of willows and came into a clearing that looked up at the stars and highest peak of the range, gleaming skull white at an impossible altitude. There was a ring of black standing stones, which looked like some sort of surreal animal trap in the moonlight. In the center was a table of stone, an altar, very old, rising out of the ground on a thick arm of basalt. The boy stood before it, trembling back and forth. His hand shook at his sides as if he unused with static electricity. The gunslinger called his name sharply, and Jake responded with the inarticulate sound of negation. The faint smear of face, almost hidden by the boy's left shoulder, looked both terrifying and exalted, and there was something else. The gunslinger stepped inside the ring, and Jake screamed, recoiling and throwing up his arms. Now his face could be seen. The gunslinger read fear and terror at war with some excruciating pleasure. The gunslinger felt it touch him, the spirit of the oracle, the succubus. His loins were suddenly filled with light, a light that was soft yet hard. He felt his head twisting, his tongue thickening and becoming sensitive to even the spittle that coated it. He didn't think about what he was doing when he pulled the half-rotted jawbone from his pocket, where he had carried it since he had found in the lair of the speaking demon at the way station. He didn't think, but it had never frightened him to operate on pure instinct. That had ever been the best and truest place for him. He held the jawbone's frozen, prehistoric grin up before his eyes, holding his arm out stiffly, first and last finger poking out in the ancient forked sign, the ward against the evil eye. Hey, Kenneth. The current of sensuality was whipped away from him like a drape. Jake screamed again. The gunslinger walked to him and held the jawbone in front of Jake's warring eyes. See this, Jake. See it very well. What came in response was a wet sound of agony. The boy tried to pull his gaze away and could not. For a moment it seemed that he might be pulled apart, mentally if not physically. Then suddenly both eyes rolled up to the whites. Jake collapsed. His body struck the earth limply, one hand almost touching the squat basalt arm that supported the altar. The gunslinger dropped to one knee and picked him up. He was amazingly light, as dehydrated as a November leaf from the long walk through the desert. Around him, Roland could feel the presence that dwelt in the circle of stones, wearing with a jealous anger. Its prize was being taken from it. Once the gunslinger passed out of the circle, the sense of frustrated jealousy faded quickly. He carried Jake back to the camp. By the time they got there, the boy's twitching unconsciousness had become deep sleep. The gunslinger paused for a moment above the gray ruin of the fire. The moonlight on Jake's face reminded him again of a church saint, alabaster purity, all unknown. He hugged the kid and put a dry kiss on his cheek, knowing that he loved him. Well, maybe that wasn't quite right. Maybe the truth was that he'd loved the kid from the first moment he'd seen him, as he had Susan Delgado, and was only now allowing himself to recognize that fact, for it was a fact. And it seemed that he could almost feel the laughter from the man in black, someplace far above them. Subchapter 4. It's going to be page 130 of chapter 3. 1 second. Jake calling him. That was how the gunslinger awoke. He tried. He tied Jake firmly to one of the tough bushes that grew nearby, and the boy was hungry and upset. By the sun, it was almost 9:30. Why'd you tie me up? Jake asked diligently as the gunslinger loosened the thick knots in the blanket. I was going to run away. I wasn't going to run away. You did run away, the gunslinger said, and the expression on Jake's face made him smile. I had to go out and get you. You were sleepwalking. I was? Jake looked at him suspiciously. I never did anything like that. The gunslinger suddenly produced a jawbone and held it in front of Jake's face. Jake flinched away from it, grimacing and raising his arm. See? Jake nodded, bewildered. What happened? We don't have time to palaver now. I have to go off for a while. I may be gone the whole day. So listen to me, boy. It's important. If sunset comes and I'm not back, fear flashed on Jake's face. You're leaving me? The gunslinger only looked at him. No, Jake said after a moment. I guess if you're going to leave me, you already would have. That's using your head. Now listen, and hear me very well. I don't want you to stay here while I'm gone. Right here in the camp. Don't stray, even if it seems like the best idea in the world. And if you feel strange, funny in any way, you pick up this bone and hold it in your hands. Hate and disgust crossed Jake's face, mixed with bewilderment. I couldn't. I just couldn't. You can. You may have to, especially after midday. It's important. You may feel pukey or headachy when you first lay hard of it, but that'll pass. Do you understand? Yeah. Will you do what I say? Yeah, but why do you have to go away? Jake burst out. I just do. The gunslinger caught another fascinating glimpse of the steel that lay under the boy's surface, as enigmatic as the story as he had told about coming from a city where the buildings were so tall that actually scraped the sky. It wasn't Cuthbert the boy reminded him of so much as his other close friend, Elaine. Elaine had been quiet and no way prone to Bert's grandstanding quackery, and he had been depending and afraid of nothing. and he had been dependable and afraid of nothing. Sorry. Hey, Brian. Hey, Biz. All right, Jake said. The gunslinger laid the jawbone carefully on the ground next to the ruins of the fire, where it grinned up through the grass like some eroded fossil that had seen the light of day after a night of 5,000 years. Jake wouldn't look at it. His face was pale and miserable. The gunslinger wondered if it would profit them for him to put the boy to sleep and question him, then decided there would be little gain. He knew well enough the spirit of the stone circle was surely a demon, and very likely an oracle as well. A demon with no shape, only a kind of uniform sexual glare with the eye of prophecy. He wondered briefly if it might not be the soul of Sylvia Pitson, that giant woman whose religious huckstering had led the final shelldown in Toll. But nah, not her. The stones in the circle were ancient. Sylvia Pitson was a jelly come lately compared to the thing that made its den here. It was old and sly, but the gunslinger knew the forms of speaking quite well and did not think the boy would have to use the jawbone mojo. The voice and mind of the oracle would be more than occupied with him. The gunslinger needed to know things in spite of the risk, and the risk was high. Yet for both Jake and himself, he needed desperately to know. The gunslinger opened his tobacco poke and pawned through it, pushing the dry strands of leaf aside until he came to a minuscule object wrapped in a fragment of white paper. He rolled it between fingers. That would all too soon be gone, and looked absently up in the sky. Then he unwrapped it and held the contents, a tiny white pill with edges that had been much worn with traveling, in his hand. Jake looked at it curiously. What's that? The gunslinger uttered a short laugh. The story Court used to tell us was that the old gods pissed over the desert and made mescaline. Jake only looked puzzled. This is a drug, the gunslinger said, but not one that puts you to sleep, one that wakes you up all the way for a little while. Like LSD? The boy agreed instantly and then looked puzzled. What's that? I don't know, Jake said. It just popped out. I think it came from, before. The gunslinger nodded, but he was doubtful. He had never heard of mescaline referred to as LSD, not even in Martin's old books. Will it hurt you? Jake asked. It never has, the gunslinger said, conscious of the evasion. I don't like it. Never mind. The gunslinger squatted in front of the waterskin, took a mouthful, and swallowed the pill. As always, he felt an immediate reaction in his mouth. It seemed overloaded with saliva. He sat down before the dead fire. When does something happen to you? Jake asked. Not for a little while. Be quiet. So Jake was quiet, watching with open suspicion as the gunslinger went calmly about the ritual of cleaning his guns. He reholstered them and said, Your shirt, Jake. Take it off and give it to me. Jake pulled his faded shirt reluctantly over his head, revealing the skinny stack of ribs, and gave it to Rollo. The gunslinger produced a needle that had been threaded into the side seam of his jeans, thread with an empty cartridge loop in his gun belt. He began to sew up a long rip in one of the sleeves of the boy's shirt. He had finished and handed the shirt back. He felt the mess beginning to take hold. There was a tightening in the stomach and a feeling that all the muscles in his body were beginning cranked up a notch. I have to go, he said, getting up. It's time. The boy half rose, his face a shadow of concern, and then he settled back. Be careful, he said. Please. Remember the jawbone, the gunslinger said. He put his hand on Jake's head as he went by and tousled the corn-colored hair. The gesture startled him into a short laugh. Jake watched after him with a troubled smile until he was gone into the willow jungle. Subchapter 5, page 134 of Chapter 2. No, Chapter 3. I'm sorry, Chapter 3. The gunslinger walked deliberately toward the circle of stones, pausing long enough to get a cool drink from the spring. He could see his own reflections in a tiny pool edged with moss and lily pads, and he looked at himself for a moment, as fascinated as Narcissus. The mind reaction was beginning to settle in, slowing down his chain of thought by swimming to increase the concatenations of every idea, every bit of sensory input, things beginning to take on weight and thickness that had been heretofore invisible. He paused, getting to his feet again, and looked through the tangled snarl of willows. Sunlight slanted through in a golden, dusty bar, and he watched the interplay of motes and tiny flying thing for a bit before going on. The drug had often disturbed him. His ego was too strong, or perhaps too simple, to enjoy being eclipsed and peeled back, made a target for more sensitive emotions. They tickled at him, and sometimes maddened him, like the touch of a cat's whiskers. But this time he felt fairly calm. That was good. He stepped into the clearing and walked straight into the circle. He stood, letting his mind run free. Yes, it was coming harder now, faster. The grass screamed green at him. It seemed that he had bent over and rubbed his hands, and in it he would stand up with green paint all over his fingers and palms. He resisted a pukous urge to try the experiment. But there was no voice from the oracle, no stirring, sexual or otherwise. He went to the altar, stood beside it for a moment. Coherent thought was now almost impossible. His teeth felt strange in his head, tiny tombstones set in pink, moist earth. The world held too much light. He climbed up the altar and lay back. His mind had become a jungle full of strange thought plans that he had never seen or suspected before, a willow jungle that had grown up around a mescaline spring. The sky was water, and he hung suspended over it. The thought gave him vertigo that seemed far away and unimportant. A line of old poetry occurred to him, not a nursery voice now. No, his mother had feared the drugs and the necessity of them, as she had feared court and the need for the beater of boys. This verse came from the Manifolk to the north of the desert, a clan of them still living among machines that usually didn't work, and which sometimes ate the men when they did. The lines played again and again, reminding him in an unconnected way that was typical of the mescaline rush, of snow falling in a globe he had owned as a child, mystic and half fantastical, beyond the reach of human range, a drop of hell, a touch of strange. The trees which overhung the altar contained faces. He watched them, abstract fascination. Here was a dragon, green and twitching. Here with a wood nymph with beckoning branch arms. Here with a living skull overgrown with slime. Faces, faces. The grasses of the clearing suddenly whipped and bent. I come. I come. Vague stirring in the flesh. How far have I come, he thought, from lying with Susan in sweet grass on the drop to this. She pressed over him, a body made of the wind, a breast of fragrant jasmine, rose, and honeysuckle. Make your prophecy, he said. Tell me what I need to know. His mouth felt full of metal. A sign, a faint swoop of weeping. The gunslinger's genitals felt drawn and hard. Over him and beyond the faces and the leaves, he could see the mountains, hard and brutal and full of teeth. The body moved against him, struggled with him. He felt his hands curl into fist. She had sent him a vision of Susan. It was Susan above him, lovely Susan Delgado, waiting for him in an abandoned drover's hut on the drop with her hair spilled down her back and over her shoulders. He tossed his head, but his face followed. Jasmine, rose, honeysuckle, old hay, the smell of love. Love me. Speak prophecy, he said. Speak truth. Please. The oracle wept. Don't be cold. It's always so cold here. Hands slipping over his flesh, manipulating, lighting him on fire, pulling him, drawing him. A perfumed black crevice, wet and warm. No, dry, cold, sterile. Have a touch of mercy, gunslinger. Ah, please, I cry your favor. Mercy. Would you have mercy on the boy? What boy? I know no boy. It's not boys I need. Oh, please. Jasmine, rose, honeysuckle, dry hay with its ghost of summer, clover. oil decanted from ancient urns, a rot for flesh, a riot for flesh. After, he said, if what you tell me is useful. Now, please, now. He let his mind coil out at her, the Theseus of emotion. The body that hung over him froze and seemed to scream. There was a brief vision tug of war between his temples. His mind was a robe gray and fibrous. For long moments there was no sound but the quiet hush of his breathing and the faint breeze which made the green faces in the trees shift and grimace. No bird sang. Zap, zap. Her hold loosened. Again, there was the sound of sobbing. It would have to be quick, or she would have to leave him. To stay now meant an intention, perhaps her own kind of death, although he had felt her chilling, drawing away to leave the circle of the stones. Wind rippled the grass in tortured patterns. Prophecy, he said, and then an even bleaker noun, truth, a weeping, tired sign. He could almost have granted the mercy she begged, but there was Jake. He would have found Jake dead or insane if he had been any later that night. Sleep then. No. Then half sleep. What she asked was dangerous, but also probably necessary. The gunslinger turned his eyes up to the faces in the leaves, a play with being enacted and there for his amusement. Worlds rose and fell before him. Empires were built across shining sands where forever machines toiled in abstract electronic frenzies. Empires declined, fell, rose again. Wheels that had spun like silent liquid moved more slowly, began to squeak, began to scream, stopped. Sand choked the stainless steel gutters of concentrated streets below. Dark skies, full of stars, like beds of cold jewels, and through it all, a dying wind of change blew, bringing with it cinnamon smell of late October. The gunslinger watched as the world moved on, and half slept. 3. This is the number of your fate. 3? Yes, 3 is mystic. 3 stands at the heart of your quest. Another number comes later. Now the number is 3. Which 3? We see in part, and thus is the mirror of prophecy darkened. Tell me what you can. The first is young, dark-haired. He stands on the brink of robbery and murder. A demon has infested him. The name of this demon is Heroin. Which demon is that? I know it not, even from my tutor's lessons. We see in part, and this is the mirror of prophecy darkened. There are other worlds, gunslinger, and other demons. These waters are deep. Watch for the doorways. Watch for the rose and the unfound doorways. The second. She comes on wheels. I see no more. The third. Death, but not for you. The man in black, where is he? Near. You will speak with him soon. Of what will we speak? The tower. The boy, Jake. Tell me of the boy. The boy is your gate to the man in black. The man in black is your gate to the 3. The 3 are your way to the dark tower. How? How can that be? Why must it be? We see in part, and thus is the God damn you. No, God damn to me. Don't patronize me, thing. What shall I call you? What shall I call you then? Star slut? Whore of the winds? Some live on love that come to the ancient places, even in those sad and evil times. Some, gunslinger, live on blood. Even I understand on the blood of young boys. May he not be spared. Yes. How? Cease, gunslinger. Strike your camp and turn back northwest. In the northwest there is still a need for men who live by the bullet. I am sworn by my father's guns and by the treachery of Martin. Martin is no more. The man in black has eaten his soul. This you know. I am sworn. Then you are damned. Have your way with me, bitch. Subchapter 6, page 139 of chapter 3. Eagerness. The shadow swung over him, enfolded him. There was sudden ecstasy broken only by a galaxy of pain, as faint and bright as ancient stars gone red with collapse. Faces came to him unabiddened. As the climax of their coupling, Sylvia Pitson, Alice, the woman from Toll, Susan, a dozen others. And finally, after eternity, he pushed her away from him, once again in his right mind, bone-weary and disgusted. No, it isn't enough. Let me be, the gunslinger said. He sat up and almost fell off the altar before regaining his feet. She touched him tentatively. Honeysuckle, jasmine, sweet altar. And he pushed her violently, falling to his knees. He made his drunken way to the perimeter of the circle. He staggered through, feeling a huge weight fall from his shoulders. He drew a stuttering, leaping breath. Had he learned enough to justify the feeling of defilement? He didn't know. In time, he supposed he would. As he started away, he could feel her standing at the bars of her prison, watching him go from her. He wondered how long it might be before someone else crossed the desert and found her hungry and alone. For a moment, he felt dwarfed by the possibilities of time. Subchapter 7, page 140 of chapter 3. You sick? Jake stood up fast when the gunslinger shambled back through the last trees and came into the camp. He had been huddled by the ruins of the tiny fire, the jawbone across his knee, gnawing discontently on the bones of the rabbit. Now he ran toward the gunslinger with a look of distress that made Roland feel the full, ugly weight of coming betrayal. No, he said, not sick, just tired, whipped. He gestured absently at the jawbone. You can let go of that, Jake. The boy threw it down, violently, rubbing his hands across his shirt after doing it. His upper lip rose and fell in a snarl that was the gunslinger believed perfectly unconsciously. The gunslinger sat down, almost fell down, feeling the aching joints and the pummeled, thick mind that was the unloving afterglow of mescaline. His crotch also pulsed with a dull ache. He rolled a cigarette with carefully unthinking slowness. Jake watched. The gunslinger had a sudden impulse to speak to the boy, Dan Din, after telling him all he had learned, then thrust the idea away with horror. He wondered if a part of him, mind or soul, might not be disintegrating. To open one's mind and heart to the command of a child. The idea was insane. We sleep here tonight. Tomorrow we start climbing. I'll go out a little later, see if I can't shoot something for supper. We need to make strength. I've got to sleep now, okay? Sure. Knock yourself out. I don't understand you. Do what you want. Ah, the gunslinger nodded and lay back. Knock myself out, he thought. Knock myself out. When he woke up, the shadows were long across the small grass clearing. Build up the fire, he told Jake and tossed him his flint and steel. Can you use that? Yes, I think so. The gunslinger walked toward the willow grove. 1 second. The gunslinger walked toward the willow grove and then stopped at the sound of the boy's voice. Stopped dead. Spark of dark, where's my sire? The boy murmured, and Roland heard the sharp chick, chick, chick of the flint. It sounded like the cry of a small mechanical bird. Will I lay me? Will I stay me? Bless this fire. Picked it up from me? The gunslinger thought, not in the least surprised to discover he was all over goosebumps and on the verge of shivering like a wet dog. Picked it up from me? Words? I don't even remember saying. And will I betray such? Ah, Roland, will thee betray such a true thread as this in a sad, unthreaded world? Could anything justify it? 'Tis just of words. Ah, but old ones, good ones. Roland, the boy cried, are you all right? Yar, he said gruffly, the tang of smoke strung faintly in his nose. These made fire. Yes, the boy said simply, and Roland did not need to turn to know the boy was smiling. The gunslinger got moving and bore left, this time skirting the willow grove. At a place where the ground opened and upward in heavy open grass, he stepped back into the shadows and stood silently, faintly, clearly. He could hear the crackle of the campfire Jake had rekindled. The sound made him smile. He stood without moving for 10 minutes, 15, 20. Three rabbits came, and once they were at a sill flame, the gunslinger pulled leather. He took them down, skinned them, and gutted them, brought them back to camp. Jake had water already steaming over the low flames. The gunslinger nodded to him. That's a good piece of work. Jake flushed with pleasure and silently handed back the flint and steel. While the stew cooked, the gunslinger used the last of the light to go back into the willow grove. Near the first pool, he had begun to hack at the tough vines that grew near the watery marsh's verge. Later, as the fire burned down to coals and Jake slept, he would paint them into ropes that might be some limited use later. But his intuition was that the climb would not be a particularly difficult one. He felt Ka at work on the surface of things and no longer even considered it odd. The vines bled green sap over his hands as he carried them back to where Jake waited. They were up with the sun and packed in half an hour. The gunslinger hoped to shoot another rabbit in the meadow as they fed, but time was short and no rabbit showed itself. The bundle of their remaining food was now so small and light that Jake carried it easily. He had toughened up, this boy. You could see it. The gunslinger carried their water freshly drawn from one of the springs. He looped his three vine ropes around his belly. They gave the circle of stones a white berth. The gunslinger was afraid the boy might feel a recurrence of fear, but when they passed above it on a stony rise, Jake only offered it in a passing glance and then looked at a bird that hovered upwind. Soon enough, the trees began to lose their height and lushness. Trunks were twisted and roots seemed to struggle with the earth in a tortured hunt for moisture. It's all so old, Jake said glumly when they paused for a rest. Isn't there anything young in this world? The gunslinger smiled and gave Jake an elbow. You are, he said. Jake responded with a wan smile. Well, will it be hard to climb? The gunslinger looked at him curiously. The mountains are high. Don't you think it will be a hard climb? Jake looked back at him, his eyes clouded and puzzled. No, they went on. We are going to be at subchapter 8 of chapter 3. We are at page 143. I'm going to take like a 1 to 2 minute break and I'll be right back. Okay, say hi to Rich. What's up, Rich? And what's up, Casino Comics? Thanks for listening. I hope you have a good day at work. Thanks for everybody joining me. I hope you all are enjoying this. Um, kind of brand new for me. All right. Actually, this is the first time I've actually read aloud to like the public. I've read aloud to my family and stuff like that, but never to other people. So this is definitely brand new for me. Um, we were at subchapter 8 on chapter 3, page 143. The sun climbed to its zenith, seemed to hang there more briefly than it ever had during the desert crossing. and then passing on, returning them their shadows. Shelves of rock protruded from the rising land like the arms of giant easy chairs burned in the earth. The shrub grass turned yellow and sere. Finally, they were faced with a deep, chimney-like crevasse in the path that scaled a short, peeling rise of rock to get around and above it. The ancient granite had faulted on lines that were step-like, and as they had both intuned, the beginning of their climb at least was easy. They paused on the 4 foot wide scarp of the top and looked back over the land to the desert, which circled around the upland with a huge yellow paw. Further off, it gleamed at them in a white shield that dazzled the eye, receding into the dim waves of rising heat. The gunslinger felt faintly amazed at the realization that this desert had nearly murdered him. From where they stood in a new coolness, the desert certainly appeared uh, monstrous, but not deadly. They turned back to the business of the climb, scrambling over jawstraw, falls of rock and crunch, walking up inclined planes of stone shot with glitters of quartz and mica. The rocks were pleasant, warm to the touch, but the air was definitely cooler. In the late afternoon, the gunslinger heard the faint sound of thunder. The rising line of the mountains obscured the sight of rain on the other side, however. When the shadow began to turn purple, they camped in the overhang of a jutted brow of rock. The gunslinger anchored their blanket above and below, fashioned a kind of shanty lean-to. They sat at the mouth of it, watching the sky spread a cloak over the world. Jake dangled his feet over the drop, the gunslinger rolling his evening smoke, and I eyed Jake half humorously. "Don't roll over in your sleep," he said, "or you may wake up in hell." "I won't," Jake replied seriously. "My mother says he broke it off." "She says what?" "That I sleep like a dead man." Jake finished. He looked at the gunslinger, who saw the boy's mouth was trembling as he strove to keep back tears. Only a boy, he thought, and pain smote him. The ice pick that too much cold water could sometimes plant in your forehead. Only a boy. Why? Silly question. When a boy, wounded in body and spirit, called the question out to court, that ancient, scarred battle engine whose job it was to teach the sons of the gunslingers the beginning of what they had to know, court would answer, "Why is crooked letter and can't be made straight?" Never made why. Just get up, pusshead. Get up. The day's young. "Why am I here?" Jake asked. "Why did I forget everything from before?" "Because the man in black has drawn you here," the gunslinger said, "and because of the tower. The tower stands at a kind of power nexus in time." "I don't understand." "Nor do I," the gunslinger said, "but something has happened. Just in my own time. The world has moved on, we say. We've always said. But it's moving on faster now. Something has happened to time. It's softening." They sat in silence, a breeze faint, but with an edge picked at their legs. Somewhere it made a hollow "woo" in a rock fissure. "Where do you come from?" Jake asked. "From a place that no longer exists. Do you know the Bible?" "Jesus and Moses, sure." The gunslinger smiled. "That's right. My land had a biblical name. New Canaan, it was called. The land of milk and honey. In the Bible's New Canaan, they were supposed to be grapes so big that men had to carry them on sledges. We didn't grow them on that big, but it was a sweet land." "I know about Ulysses," Jake said hesitantly. "Was he in the Bible?" "Maybe," the gunslinger said. "I was never a scholar of it, and I can't say for sure." "But the others, your friends?" "No others," the gunslinger said. "I am the last." A tiny wasted moon began to rise, casting its slitted gaze down into the tumble of rocks where they sat. "Was it pretty? Your country? Your land?" "It was beautiful," the gunslinger said. "There were fields and forests and rivers and mist in the morning, but that's only pretty. My mother used to say that only real pretty is old is order and love and light. Jake made a non-committal noise. The gunslinger smoked and thought of how it had been. The nights in the huge central hall, hundreds of richly clad figures moved through the slow, steady waltz step, or the faster, light ripples of the pole cam. Aline Reader on his arm, that one his parents had chosen for him, he supposed. Her eyes brighter than the most precious gems, the light of the crystal enclosed sparklights shining in the newly done hair of the courtesans and the half-cynical armors. The hall had been huge, an island of light whose age was beyond telling, as was the whole central place, which made up nearly 100 stone castles. It had been unknown years since he had seen it, leaving it for the last time. Roland had ached as he turned his face away from it and began his first cast for the trial of the man in black. Even when the walls had fallen, weeds grown in the courtyards, bats roosted amongst the great beams of the central hall, and the galleries echoed with the soft swoop and whisper of the shallows. Fields where court had taught them archery and gunnery and falconry had gone to hay and timothy and wild vines. In the huge kitchen where Hax had once held his fuming and aromatic court, a grotesque colony of slow mutants nested, peering at him from the merciful darkness of pantries and shadowed pillars. The warm steam that had been filled with the pungent odors of roasting beef and pork had changed to the clammy damp of moss. Giant white toadstools grew in corners where not even the slow muties dared to encamp. The huge oak subcellar bulkhead stood open, and the most pungent smell of all had issued from that, an odor that seemed to express with a flat finality all the hard facts of dissolution and decay, the hard, sharp odor of wine gone to vinegar. It had been no struggle to turn his face to the south and leave it behind, but it had hurt his heart. Was there a war? Jake asked. Even better, the gunslinger said, and pitched the last smoldering ember of his cigarette away. There was a revolution. We won every battle and lost the war. No one won the war, unless maybe it was for the scavengers. There must have been rich pickings for years after. I wish I'd lived there, Jake said wistfully. Do you say so? I do. Time to turn in, Jake. The boy, now only a dim shadow, turned to his side and circled up with a blanket tossed loosely over him. The gunslinger sat silently over for perhaps an hour after thinking his long, sober thoughts. Such meditation was a novel thing for him, sweet in the melancholy sort of way, but still utterly without practical value. There was no solution to the problem of Jake other than the one the oracle had offered him, and turning away was simply not possible. There might have been tragedy in the situation, but the gunslinger did not see that. He only saw the predestination that had always been there, and finally the more natural character reasserted itself, and he slept deeply, with no dreams. We're going to be on subchapter 9 of chapter 3, page 148. The climb became grimmer on the following day as they continued to angle toward the narrow V on the pass through the mountains. The gunslinger pushed slowly, still with no sense of hurry. The dead stone beneath their feet left no trace of the man in black, but the gunslinger knew he had been this way before them, not only from the path of his climb, as he and Jake had observed him, tiny and bud-like from the foothills. His aroma was printed on every cold downdraft of the air. It was an oily, sardonic odor, as bitter to the nose as the stench of the devil grass. Jake's hair had grown much longer, and it curled slightly at the base of his sunburned neck. He climbed through, moving with sure-footedness and no apparent acrophobia as they crossed gaps or scaled their way up ledged faces. Twice already he had gone up in place the gunslinger could not have managed, and anchored one of the ropes so the gunslinger could climb up hand over hand. The following morning they climbed through a coldly damp snatch of cloud that blotted out the tumbling slopes below them. Patches of hard, granulated snow began to appear nestled in some of the deeper pockets of stone. It glittered like quartz, and its texture was dry as sand. That afternoon, they found a single footprint in one of the snow patches. Jake stared at it for a moment with awful fascination, then looked up frightfully, as if expecting to see the man in black materialize into his own footprint. The gunslinger tapped him on the shoulder and then pointed out, "Go. This day's getting old." Later, they made camp in the light of the daylight on the wide, flat ledge to the east and north of the cut that slanted into the heart of the mountains. The air was frigid. They could see the puffs of the breath, and the humid sound of thunder, and the red and purple afterglow of the day was surreal, slightly lunatic. The gunslinger thought the boy might begin to question him, but there were no questions from Jake. The boy fell almost immediately into sleep. The gunslinger followed for his example. He dreamed again of Jake as an alabaster saint with a nail through his forehead. He woke with a gasp, tasting the cold thinness of the altitude in his lungs. Jake was asleep beside him, but his sleep was not easy. He twisted, mumbled to himself, chased his own phantoms. The gunslinger lay over uneasy and slept again. We're going to be on subchapter 10 of chapter 3, page 149. Give me 1 second. All right, all right, all right. We are on subchapter 10, chapter 3, page 149. Okay. A week after Jake saw the footstep, they faced the man in black for a brief moment in time. In that moment, the gunslinger felt that he could almost understand the implication of the tower itself, for for that moment seemed to stretch out forever. They continued southeast, reaching a point perhaps halfway through the Cyclonian mountain range, and just as the going seemed about to become really difficult for the first time, above them, seeming to lean out, the icy ledges and screaming butts made the gunslinger feel an unpleasant reverse vertigo. They began to descend again along the side of the narrow pass, and an augular, zigzagging path led them toward a canyon floor where an icy edged stream boiled from a slightly headlong power from a higher country still. On the afternoon, the boy paused and looked back at the gunslinger, who had paused to wash his face in the stream. "I smell him," Jake said. "So do I." Ahead of them, the mountain threw up its final defense, a huge slab of insurmountable granite facing the climb into cloudy infinity. At any moment, the gunslinger expected a twist in the stream to bring them upon a high waterfall in the insurmountable smoothness of rock. Dead end. But the air here and the odd magnifying quality that is common to high places, and it was another day beyond before they reached the great granite face. The gunslinger began to feel the tug of anticipation again, the feeling that it was all finally in his grasp. He had been through this before, many times, and still had to fight himself to keep from breaking into an eager trot. "Wait!" The boy had stopped suddenly. They faced a sharp elbow bend in the stream. It boiled and frothed around the eroded hang of a giant sandstone boulder. All that morning they had been in the shadow of the mountains as the canyon narrowed. 1 second. Hey, Rolando. Jake was trembling violently in his hand, and his face had gone pale. His hand. What's the matter? Let's go back, Jake whispered. "Let's go back quick." The gunslinger face was wooden. "Please." The boy's face was drawn, and his jawline shook with suppressed agony. Through the heavy blanket of stone, they still heard thunder. As steady as machines in the earth, the slice of sky they could see that itself assumed a turbulent Gothic gray above them as warm and cold currents met and warred. Please, please! The boy raised a fist as if to strike the gunslinger's chest. No! The boy's face took on wonder. You're going to kill me. He killed me the first time, and you're going to kill me this time. And I think you know it. The gunslinger felt the lie on his lips and then spoke it. You'll be all right. And greater lie yet. I'll take care. Jake's face went gray, and he said no more. He put an unwilling hand out, and he and the gunslinger went around the elbow bend that way, hand in hand. On the other side, they came face to face with the final rising wall and the man in black. He stood no more than 20 feet above them, just to the right of the waterfall that crashed and spilled from a huge, ragged hole in the rock. Unseen wind rippled and tugged at his hooded robe. He held a staff in one hand. The other hand he held out to them in a mocking gesture of welcome. He seemed a prophet, and below the rushing sky, mounted on a ledge of rock, a prophet of doom. The voice of Jeremiah. Gunslinger! How well you fulfill the prophecies of old! Good day, good day, good day! He laughed and bowed, the sound echoing over the bellow of the falling water. Without a thought, the gunslinger had drawn his pistols. The boy cowered to his right and behind a small shadow. Roland fired 3 shots. Roland fired 3 times before he could gain control of his traitor hands. The echoes bounced their bronze tones against the rock valley that rose around them over the sound of the wind and the water. A spray of granite puffed over the head of the man in black, a second to the left of his hood, and a third to the right. He had missed cleanly all 3 times. The man in black laughed, a fool-hearted laugh that seemed to challenge the receding echo of gunshots. Would you kill all your answers so easily, gunslinger? Come down, the gunslinger said. Do I beg you? And we'll have all answers all around. Again, the huge, diversive laugh. So now your bullets are fear, Roland. It's your idea of the answers that scares me. Come down. We'll speak on the other side. I think, the man in black said. On the other side, we will hold much counsel and long palaver. Just like it. His eyes flickered to Jake, and he added, just the 2 of us. Jake flinched away from him with a small whining cry, and the man in black turned. His robe swirled in the gray air like a batwing. He disappeared into the cleft of the rock from which the water spewed at full force. The gunslinger exercised grim and will and did not send a bullet after him. Would you kill all your answers so easily, gunslinger? There was only the sound of wind and water, a sound that had been in the place of the desolation of 1,000 years. Yet the man in black had stood there, 12 years after his last glimpse. Roland had seen him close up again and spoken to him, and the man in black had laughed. On the other side, we will hold much counsel and long palaver. The boy looked up at him, his body trembling. For a moment, the gunslinger saw the face of Allie, the girl from Tull, semi-imposed over Jake's, the scar standing out on her head like a mute accusation, and felt brute loathing for them both. It wouldn't occur to him until much later that both the scar on Allie's forehead and the nail he saw spiked through Jake's forehead in his dreams were in the same place. Jake perhaps caught a whiff of this thought. A moan slipped from his throat. Then he twisted his lips and cut the sound off. He held the markings of a fine man, and perhaps a gunslinger in his own right, if given time. Just the 2 of us. The gunslinger felt a great unholy thirst in some deep and unknown pit of his own body. One no draught of water or wine could touch. Words trembled almost within reach of his fingers, and in some instinctively way he strove not to be corrupted, knowing in his colder mind that such strife was vain and always would be. In the end, there was only Ka. It was noon. He looked up, letting the cloudy, unsettled day light shine for the last time on the all too vulnerable son of his own righteousness. No one ever really pays for betrayal in silver, he thought. The price of any betrayal always comes due in flesh. Come with me, or stay, the gunslinger said. The boy responded to this with a hard and humorless grin, his father's grin, had he but known it. And I'll be fine if I stay, he said. Fine. All by myself here in the mountains? Someone will come and save me? They'll have cake and sandwiches, coffee and thermoses too. Do you say so? Come with me or stay, the gunslinger repeated, and felt something happening in his mind, an uncoupling. This was the moment at which the small figure before him ceased to be Jake and became only the boy, an impersonable to be moved and used. Something screamed. In the windy stillness, he and the boy both heard. The gunslinger began to climb, and after a moment Jake came after him. Together they mounted the tumbling rock beside the steely cold falls and stood where the man in black had stood before them. And together they entered, and where he had disappeared, the darkness swallowed them. That is the end of chapter 3. We are going to start chapter 4, the slow mutants. I'll show you the little picture. I'm going to take a break real quick before I start this next chapter. I'll be back in let's say 2 minutes. Okay, sorry for the wait. We are at chapter 4, titled The Slow Mutants. This is going to be subchapter 1. It's going to be on page 157. The gunslinger spoke slowly to Jake in the rising and falling inflections of one who speaks in his sleep. There were 3 of us that night, Cuthbert, Elaine, and me. There's something I'd also like to add that normally his name is pronounced, I think it's like, it's not Cuthbert, it's like with a Q. It's spelled with a C, so I always read it as like Cuthbert. So that's how I'm saying it. And there's a couple different names that I might be saying. That's the way I've always said them. Even I've even heard the audio versions, and it just that's the way they are to me. So if you hear some random names that you don't recognize, it's the same names you know. I'm just that's my pronunciation. All right, I'll start over. um. The gunslinger spoke slowly to Jake in the rising and falling inflections of one who speaks in the sleep. There were 3 of us that night, Cuthbert, Elaine, and me. We were supposed to be there, and because none of us had passed for the time of children, we were still in our clouds, as they say, as the saying went. And if we had been caught, court would have stripped us bloody. But we weren't. I don't think any of the ones that went before us were caught either. Boys must put on their father's pants in private, strut them in front of the mirror, and then sneak them back on their hangers. It was like that. Their fathers pretended he doesn't notice the new way the pants are hung up or the traces of the boot polish mustaches still under their noses. Do you see? The boy said nothing. He said nothing since they had passed from the daylight. The gunslinger, on the other hand, had talked heretically, feverishly, to fill the silence. He had not looked back at the light as they passed into the land beneath the mountains, but the boy had. The gunslinger had read the falling of dry in the soft mirror of Jake's cheek, now faint rose, now milk glass, now pallid silver, now the last dusk glow touch of evening, now nothing. The gunslinger had struck a false light, and they had gone on. Finally they camped. No echo from the man in black returned to them. Perhaps he had stopped to rest too. Or perhaps he had floated onward, and without running lights, though nighted chambers, or through nighted chambers. The sewing night cotillion, the Kamala, some of the older folk called it, after the word of rice, was held once a year in the Western Hall. The gunslinger went on. The proper name was the Hall of the Grandfathers, but to us it was only the Western Hall. The sound of dripping water came to their ears. A courting rite, as any spring dance surely is. The gunslinger laughed de- depreciatingly. The incident walls turned the sound like a loon, like wheeze. In the old days, the books say it was the welcoming of spring, what was sometimes called New Earth or fresh Kamala. But civilization, you know. He trailed off, unable to describe the change, incoherent in that featureless noun, the death of romance and the lingering of its sterile, carnal revenant, a world living on the forced respiration of glitter and ceremony, the geometric steps of make-believe courtship during the sewing night cotillion that had replaced the truer matter, scribble-scrabble, of love which he could only intune dimly, hollow grandeur in place of true passions which might once have built kingdoms and sustained them. He found the truth with Susan Delgado and Magus, only to lose it again. Once there was a king, he might have told the boy, the eld whose blood, inoculated through it might be, still flows in his veins. But kings are done, lad, in the light, in the world of the light, anyway. They made something decadent out of it, the gunslinger said at last, a play, a game, and the voice was all in conscious distance of the aesthetic and the ermite. His face, had there been stronger light to illuminate it, would have shown harshness and sorrow, the purest kind of contamination. His essential force, had it not been cut or diluted by the passage of years, the lack of imagination would still remain in the face of remarkable. But the ball, the gunslinger said, the sewing night. The boy did not speak, did not ask. There were crystal chandeliers, heavy glass with electric sparklights. It was all light. It was an island of light. We sneaked into one of the balconies, the ones that were supposed to be unsafe, and roped off. But we were boys, and boys will be boys, so they will. To us, everything was dangerous, but what of that? Had we not been made to live forever? We thought so, even when we spoke to each of our glorious deaths. We were above everyone and could look down on everything. I don't remember that any I don't remember that any of us said anything. We only drank it up with our eyes. There was a great stone table where the gunslingers and their women sat at meat, watching the dancers. Few of the gunslingers also danced, but only a few. And they were the young ones. The ones who sprang the trap on hacks was the one of the dancers, I seem to recall. The elders only sat, and it seemed to me they were only half embarrassed in all the light and all the civilized light. They were the reverend ones, the feared ones, the guardians, but they seemed like holstered in the crowd of cavaliers with their soft women. There were four circular tables loaded with food, and they turned all the time. The cook boys never stopped coming and going from 7 until 3 o'clock. that next morning. The tables were like clocks, and we could smell roast pork, beef, lobster, chickens, and baked apples. The odors changed as the tables turned. They were there were ices and candies. There were great flaming skewers of meat. Martin sat next to my mother and father. I knew them even from so high above. And once she and Martin danced, slowly and revolvingly, and the others cleared the floor for them and clapped it when it was over. The gunslingers did not clap, but my father stood slowly and held his hands out to her, and she went to him smiling, holding out her own. It was a moment of enormous gravity. Even he felt our own hiding place. My father had been taking control of his quartet, you must ken, the tet of the gun, and was on the verge of becoming Den of Gilead, if not all in-world. The rest knew it. Martin knew it better than any, except perhaps for Gabrielle Versus, that was. The boy spoke at last, and with seeming reluctance, she was your mother? I, Gabrielle of the Waters, daughter of Elaine, wife of Stephen, mother of Roland. The gunslinger spread his hands apart in a mocking little gesture that seemed to say, "Here I am, and what of it?" Then he dropped them into his lap again. My father was the last Lord of Light. The gunslinger looked down at his hands. The boy said nothing. I remember how they danced, the gunslinger said. My mother and Martin, the gunslinger's counselor. I remembered how they danced, revolving slowly together and apart, in the old steps of courtship. He looked at the boy, smiling. But it meant nothing, you know, because power had been passed in some ways that none of them knew all but understood. And my mother has grown root and branches to the holder and wielder of that power. Was it not so? She went to him when the dance was over, didn't she? And clasped his hands. Did they applaud? Did the hall ring with it as those pretty boys and their soft ladies applauded and lauded him? Did it? Did it? Bitter water dripped distantly in the darkness. The boy said nothing. I remember how they danced, the gunslinger said softly. I remember how they danced. He looked up at the unseeably stone roof, and it seemed for a moment that he might scream at it, rail at it, challenge it blindly. Those blind and tongueless tonnages of granite that now bore the tiny lives that microbes in its stone intestine. What hand could have held the knife that did my father to his death? I'm tired, the boy said, and then again, no more. The gunslinger lapsed into silence, and the boy laid over and put one hand between his cheek and the stone. The little flame in front of them guttered. The gunslinger rolled a smoke. It seemed he could see a crystal light still in the eye of his memory, hear the shout of Alcalade, empty in a hushed land that stood even the hopeless against the gray ocean of time, remembering that in its land of a light hurt him bitterly. He wished he had never held witness to it, or to his father's cockholdry. He passed between his mouth and nostrils, looking down at the boy. How we make large circles in earth for ourselves, he thought. Around we go, back to the start, and the start is there again. Resumption. Which was ever the curse of daylight? How long before we see daylight again? He slept. After the sound of his breathing had become long and steady and irregular, the boy opened his eyes and looked at the gunslinger with an expression of sickness and love. The last light of the fire caught in one pupil for a moment and was drowned there. He went to sleep. It's going to be subchapter 2 of what chapter now? Chapter 4? Yeah, chapter 4. I'll be right back. Give me 1 second. Sorry, I had to go cry a little. It's so touching. Jake. No, I'm playing. All right, chapter 4, subchapter 2, page 162. The gunslinger had lost most of the time since in the desert, which was changeless. He lost the rest of it here in the passage under the mountains, which was lightless. Neither of them had any meaning, any means of telling the clock, and the concept of hours became meaningless, abnegate. In a sense, they stood outside of time. A day might have been a week, a day. They walked, they slept, they ate thin meals. They did not satisfy their bellies. Their only companion was the steady thundering rush of the water, drilling in its augural path through the stone. They followed it and drank from its flat, mineral salted depth, halted, hoping there was nothing in it that would make them sick or kill them. At times, the gunslinger thought he saw fugitive drifting lights like corpse lamps beneath its surface. But suppose they were only projections of his brains, which had not forgotten the light. Still he cautioned the boy not to put his feet in the water. The range finder in his head took them on steadily. The path beside the water, for it was a path, smooth, sunken to a light concavity, led always upward, toward the river's head, at irregular intervals that came to curved stone pylons with sunken ring bolts. Perhaps once for oxen or stage horses had been tethered here. At each was a steel flagon holding an electric torch, but these were all barren of life and light. During the third period of the rest before sleep, the boy wandered away a little. The gunslinger could hear small conversations of rattled pebbles as Jake moved cautiously. Careful, he said. You can't see where you are. I'm crawling. It's safe. What is it? The gunslinger half crouched, touching the haft of one gun. There was a slight pause. The gunslinger strained his eyes uselessly. I think it's a railroad, the boy said dubiously. The gunslinger got up and walked toward the sound of Jake's voice, leading with one foot lightly to test for pitfalls. Here. A hand reached out and cat-pawed the gunslinger's face. The boy was very good in the dark, better than Roland himself. His eyes seemed to dilate until there was no color left in them. The gunslinger saw, then as he struck a meager light, there was no fuel in the rock womb, and what they had brought with them had been going rapidly to ash. At times the urge to strike a light was well nigh insatiable. They had discovered one could grow as hungry for light as for food. The boy was standing beside a curved rock wall that was lined with parallel metal staves running off into the darkness. Each carried black nodes that might once have been conductors of electricity, and beside and below, set only inches off the stone floor, were tracks of bright metal. What might have run off those tracks at one time? The gunslinger could have only imagined sleek electric bullets firing their courses through the forever night with perforated searchlight eyes going before. He had never heard of such things, but they were many remnants of the gone world, just as there were demons. The gunslingers had once come upon a hermit who gained a quasi-religious power over a miserable flock of kind keepers by possessing of an ancient gasoline pump. The hermit crouched beside it, one arm wrapped possessively around it, and preached wild, guttering sermons. 1 second. He occasionally placed a bright steel nozzle which was attached to a rotted rubber hose between his legs on the pump in a perfectly legible, although rust-clotted, letters with a legend of unknown meaning. Amico, lead-free. Amico had become the totem of a thunder god, and they had worshipped him, and the slaughter of sheep and the sound of engines. Rum, 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 rum. Hulks, the gunslinger thought. Only meaningless hulks poking from sands that once were seas, and now a railroad. We follow it, he said. The boy said nothing. The gunslinger extinguished the light and they slept. When Roland awoke, the boy was up from before him, sitting on one of the rails, watching him sightlessly in the dark. They followed the rails like blind men, Roland leading, Jake following. They slipped their feet along one rail always. Also, like blind men, the steady rush of the river off to the right was their companion. They did not speak. They went on for 3 periods of walking. The gunslinger felt no urge to think coherently or to plan. His sleep was dreamless. During the fourth period of walking and waking and walking, they literally stumbled on a handcar. The gunslinger ran into it chest high, and the boy, walking on the other side, struck his forehead and went down with a cry. The gunslinger made a light immediately. "Are you all right?" The words sounded sharp and angry, and he winced at them. "Yes," the boy said, holding his head gingerly. He shook at it once to make sure he had told the truth. They turned to look at what they had ran into. It was a flat, square plate of metal that sat mutely on the tracks. There was a seesaw handle in the center of the square. It descended into the connection of cogs. The gunslinger had no immediate sense of the thing's purpose, but the boy grasped at it at once. "It's a handcar." "What?" "A handcar," the boy said impatiently. "Like in the old cartoons. Look." He pulled himself up and went to the handle. He managed to push it down and took all his weight hung over the handle to turn the trick. The handcar moved a foot with silent timelessness on the rails. "Good," said a faint mechanical voice. It made them both jump. "Good. Push. The mechanical voice died out. "It works a little hard," the boy said, and as if apologizing for the thing. The gunslinger pulled himself up beside Jake and shoved the handle down. The handcar moved forward obediently and then stopped. "Good. Push again," the mechanical voice encouraged. He had felt the drive shaft then beneath his feet. The operation pleased him, and so did the mechanical voice, although he intended to listen to that no longer than necessary. Other than the pump at the way station, this was the first machine he'd seen in the years that still worked well. But the thing disacquainted him, too. It would take them to the destination that much the quicker. He had no doubt whatever that the man in black had meant for them to find this, too. "Neat, huh?" the boy said, and the voice was full of loathing. The silence was deep. Roland could hear his organs at work inside his body and the drip of water and nothing else. "You stand on one side, I stand on the other," Jake said. "You'll have to push it by yourself until it gets rolling good, and then I can help. First you push, then I push. We'll go right along. Get it?" "I get it," the gunslinger said. His hands were in helpless, despairing fists. "But you'll have to push it yourself until it gets rolling good," the boy repeated, looking at him. The gunslinger had a sudden vivid picture of the great hall, a year or so after the sewing night cotillion. But then it had been nothing but shattered shards in the wake of the revolt, civil strife, and invasion. The image was followed by one of Allie, the scarred woman from Toll, pushed and pulled by the bullets that were killing her for no reason at all, unless reflex was a reason. Next came Cuthbert Allgood's face, laughing as he went downhill to his death, still blowing that goddamn horn. And then he saw Susan's face, twisted, made ugly with weeping, and all my good friends, the gunslinger thought, and smiled hideously. "I'll push," the gunslinger said. He began to push, and when the voice began to speak, "Good, push again, good, push again," he sent his hands fumbling along the post upon which the seesaw handle had been balanced. At last he found what he was surely looking for, a button. He pushed it. "Goodbye, pal," the mechanical voice said cheerily, and was then blessedly silent for some hours. We're going to be on subchapter 3 of chapter 4, page 166. Give me 1 second. Okay, so chapter 3. They rode on through the dark, faster now, no longer having to feel their way. The mechanical voice spoke up once, suggesting they eat crisp Allah, and again to say nothing is satisfied at the end of the day. A hard day like Larcher's. Following the second piece of advice, it spoke no more. Once the awkwardness of the burned age had been run off the handcar, it went smoothly. The boy tried to do his share, and the gunslinger allowed him small shifts, but mostly he pumped by himself, in large, chest-stretching rising and fallings. The underground river was their companion, sometimes closer on the right, sometimes further away. Once it took on a huge, thundering hollowness, as if passing through some great cathedral narthex. Once the sound of it disappeared almost together, altogether. The speed and the made wind against their faces seemed to take the place of the sight and to drop them once again into a frame of time. The gunslinger estimated that they were making anywhere from 10 to 15 miles an hour, always on a shallow, almost imperceptible uphill grade. They wore him they wore him out deceptively. When they stopped, he slept like a stone itself. The food was almost gone again. Neither of them worried about it. For the gunslinger, the tenseness of the coming climax was imperceivably, but as real and as articulative as the fatigue of propelling the handcar. They were close to the end of the beginning, or at least he was. He felt like a performer placed on a center stage minutes before the rise of the curtain, settled in position with his first line held securely in his mind. He heard the unseen audience rattling programs and settling in their seats. He lived he lived with a tight, tidy ball of unholy anticipation in his belly and welcomed the exercise that let him sleep. And when he did sleep, it was like the dead. The boy spoke less and less, but at their stopping places, one sleep period not long before they had attacked by the slow mutants, he asked the gunslinger almost shyly about his coming of age. For I would hear more of that, he said. The gunslinger had been leaning with his back against the handle, a cigarette from his dwindling supply. He had, I think I popped off for a second. The gunslinger had been leaning with his backs against the handle, a cigarette from his dwindling supply of tobacco clamped in his lips. He had been on the verge of his usual unthinking sleep when the boy asked him his question. Why would thee still to know that? He asked, amused. The boy's voice was curiously stubborn, as if hiding embarrassment. I just would. And after a pause, he added, I always wondered about growing up. I bet it's mostly lies. Most of what you hear wasn't my growing up, the gunslinger said, but I suppose I did the first of that not long after what thee'd hear of. When you fought your teacher, Jake said remotely. That's what I want to hear. Roland nodded. Yes, of course. The day he had tried the line, that was a story any boy might want to hear, all right. My real growing up didn't start until my dad sent me away. I finished doing it. I finished doing it at one place and another along the way. He paused. I saw a knot man hung once. A knot man? I don't understand. You could feel him, but you couldn't see him. Jake nodded and seemed to understand. Was he invisible? Roland raised his eyebrows. He had never heard the word before. Do you say so? Yes. Then let it be so. In any case, there were folks who didn't want me to do it. Felt they would be cursed if I did it. But the fellow had forgotten a taste for rape. Had gotten a taste for rape. Do you know what that is? Yes, Jake said. And I bet an invisible guy would be good at it too. How did you catch him? That's a tale for another day. Knowing there would be no other days, both of them knowing there would be no others, the 2 years after that, I left a girl in a place called Kingstown, although I didn't want to. Sure you did, the boy said, and in the contempt in the voice with no less for the softness of his tone. Got to catch up with that tower, am I right? Got to keep on riding, just like the cowboys on my dad's network. Roland felt his face flush with the heat and the dark, but when he spoke, his voice was even. That was the last part, I guess, of my growing up. I mean, I never knew any of the parts when they happened. Only later did I know that. He realized with some unease that he was avoiding what the boy wanted to hear. I suppose the coming of age was part of it. At that, he said, almost grudgingly. It was formal, almost stylized, like a dance. He laughed unpleasantly. The boy said nothing. It was necessary to prove oneself in battle. The gunslinger began. We're going to be on subchapter 4 of chapter 4, page 169. I'm going to take a 1 minute break. I got to go get something to drink. Okay. Chapter 4, subchapter 4, page 169. Summer and hot. Full Earth had come to the land like a vampire lover that year, killing the land and the crops of the tenant farmers, turning the field of the castle city of Gilead white and sterile. In the west, some miles distant, near the borders that were the end of the civilized world, fighting had already begun. All reports were bad, all of them paled to insignificance before the heat that rested over the palace of the center. Cattle lolled empty-eyed in the pens of the stockyards. Pigs grunted lustlessly, unmindful of sows and secks and knives, and waited for the coming fall. People whined about taxes and conception, as they always did, but there was an apathy beneath the empty passion play of politics. The center had frayed like a rag rug that had been washed out and walked on and sunken and hung and dried. The thread that held the last jewel at the breast of the world was unraveling. Things were not holding together. The earth drew in its breath in the summer of the coming eclipse. The boy idled along the upper corridor of the stone palace which was home, sensing these things, not understanding. He was also dangerous and empty, waiting to be filled. It was 3 years since the hanging of the cook, who had always been able to find snacks for hungry boys. Roland had lengthened and filled out both shoulders and hip. Now dressed only in faded denim pants, 14 years old, he had come to look like the man he would become, lean and lank, quick on his feet. He was still embedded, but the two of the younger slanterns of the West Town merchants had cast eyes on him. He felt a response, and felt it more strongly now. Even in the coolness of the passage, he felt sweat on his body. Give me 1 second. Anyway. Hey, Robin. Ahead, his mother's apartment. Ahead were his mother's apartments, where he approached them incuriously, meaning only to pass them and go upward to the roof where a thin breeze and the pleasure of his hand awaited. He had passed the door when a voice called him. You, boy. It was Martin, the counselor. He had dressed with suspicion, upsetting casualness. Black whipcord trousers almost as tight as leotards, and a white shirt open halfway down his hairless chest. His hair was tousled. The boy looked at him silently. Come in, come in. Don't stand in the hall. Your mother wants to speak to you. He was smiling with his mouth, but the lines of his face held a deeper, more sardonic humor. Beneath that, in his eyes, there was only coldness. In truth, his mother did not seem to want to see him. She sat in the low back chair by the large window in the central parlor of his apartments, the one which overlooked the hot blank stone of the central courtyard. She was dressed in a loose and formal gown that kept slipping from one shoulder and looked at the boy only once. A quick, glittering, rueful smile, like autumn sun on a reel of water. During the interview which followed, she studied her hands rather than her son. He saw her seldom now, and the phantom of cradle songs, Chisset, Chusset, Chisset, Chasset, had already faded from his brain. But she was beloved, but she was a beloved stranger, and he felt an amorous fear and an incoherent hatred for Martin, his father's closest adviser, was born. Are you well, Ro? She asked softly. Martin stood beside her, a heavy, disturbing hand near the juncture of her white shoulder and white neck, smiling on them both. His brown eyes were dark to the point of blackness with smiling. Yes, he said. Your studies go well? Vanny is pleased in court? Her mouth quickened at the same name, as she had tasted something bitter. I'm trying, he said. They both knew he was not fashionably intelligent like Cooper, or even quick like Jamie, but he was a plotter and a bludgeoner. Even Elaine was better at studies. And David? She knew his affection for the hawk. The boy looked up at Martin, still smiling, paternally down on all of this. Past his prime. His mother seemed to wince. For a moment Martin's face seemed to darken. His grip on her shoulder seemed to tighten. Then she looked out into the hot whiteness of the day, and all all was as it had been. Yeah. Okay. It's a charade, he thought. A game. Who is playing with whom? You've cut your head on your forehead, Martin said, still smiling and pointing a negligent finger at the mark of Court's latest "thank you for this instructive day" bashing. Are you going to be a fighter like your father, or are you just slow? This time, she did wince. Both, the boy said. He looked steadily at Martin and smiled painfully. Even in here, it was very hot. Martin stopped smiling abruptly. You can go up to the roof now, boy. I believe you have business there. My mother was not yet dismissed me, bondsman. Martin's face twisted as if the boy had lashed him with a quirk. The boy heard his mother's dreadful, woeful gasp. She had spoke his name, but the painful smile remained intact on the boy's face, and he stepped forward. Will you give me a sign of fealty, bondsman, in the name of my father whom you serve? Martin stared at him rankly unbelievingly. Go, Martin said gently. Go and find your hand. Smiling rather horridly, the boy went. As he closed the door and went back the way he came, he heard his mother wail. It was a banshee sound, and then unbelievably the sound of his father's man striking her and telling her to shut her quack. Shut her quack? And then he heard Martin's laugh. The boy continued to smile as he went to his test. We're at subchapter 5 of chapter 4, page 172. Give me 1 second. Robin, what do you mean? Does this count if you are monetized? I don't plan to, so um But I'm pretty sure I'd have to like do this in a different fashion if I was monetized. Like I'd have to like ask permission and stuff like that. With with my opportunity of not being monetized, like I haven't even put in the copyright and the description. I will if they copyright flag me. But I mean, I'm not intending to do this for money or gain. I'm just hoping you'll enjoy this and maybe reading along. Maybe this is the first time. I don't know. This is just for fun. All right, so we are at subchapter 5 of chapter 4, page 172. Jamie had come from the shops, and when he saw the boy crossing the exercise yard, he ran to tell Roland the latest gossip of bloodshed and revolt to the west. But he fell aside, the words all unspoken. They had known each other since the time of infancy, and as the boys they had dared each other, cuffed each other, and had made thousands explorations of the walls within which they had been birthed. The boy strode past him, staring without seeing, grinning his painful grin. He was walking towards Court's cottage, where the shades were drawn to ward off the savage afternoon heat. Court napped in the afternoon so that he could enjoy to the fullest extent his evening tomcat forays into the mazed and filthy brothels of the lower town. Jamie knew in a flash of intuition, knew what was to come. And in his fear and ecstasy, he had torn between following Roland and going after the others. Then his hypnotism was broken, and he ran toward the main building, screaming, "Cuthbert! Alan! Thomas!" His screams sounded puny and thin in the heat. They had known, all of them, in that intuitive way boys had, that Roland would be the first of them to try the line. But this was too soon. The hideous grin on Roland's face galvanized him, as no news of wars, revolts, witchcrafts could have done. This was more than the words from a toothless mouth given over fly-specked heads of lettuce. Roland walked to the cottage of his teacher and kicked the door open, slammed backwards, hit the plain rough plaster of the wall, and rebounded. He had never been inside before. The entrance opened on an austere kitchen that was cool and brown. A table, two straight chairs, two cabinets, a faded linoleum floor, tracked in black paths from the cooler set in the floor to the counter where knives hung on the table. Here was a public man's privacy, the faded refuge of a violent midnight carouseur who had loved the boys for 3 generations roughly and made some of them into gunslingers. Court! He kicked the table, sending it across the room into the counter. Knives from the wall rack flew into twinkling jackstraws. There was a thick stirring in the other room, a half-sleep clearing of the throat. The boy did not enter, knowing it was a sham, knowing that Court had awakened immediately in the cottage's other room and stood, one glittering eye, beside the door, waiting to break the intruder's unwary neck. Court, I want you, bondsman. Now he spoke the high speech, and Court swung the door open. He was dressed in his underwear shorts, a squat man with bow legs, ruined with scars from top to toe, thick with the twists of muscle. There was a round, bulging belly, but the boy knew from experience that it was spring steel. The one good eye glared at him from the bashed and dentist's hairless head. The boy saluted formally. Teach me no more, bondsman. Today I teach you. You early, Peeler, Court said casually, but he also spoke the high speech. 2 years early, at the very best. I should judge, and I will ask only once, will you cry off? The boy only smiled, his hideous, painful smile. For Court, who had seen the smile on score of bloodied, skied fields of honor and dishonor, it was answer enough, perhaps the only answer he would have believed. It's too bad, the teacher said absently. You've been a most promising pupil, the best in 2 dozen years, I should say. It would be sad to see you broken and set upon a blind path, but the world has moved on. Bad times are on horseback. The boy did not speak, and would have been incapable of any incoherent explanation, had it been required. But for the first time, the awful smile softened a little. There's still the line of blood, Court said. Revolt and witchcraft to the west or no, I am the bondsman, boy. I recognize your command and bow it now, if never again, with all my heart. In court, who had cuffed him, kicked him, bled him, cursed him, and made mock of him, called him the very eye of syphilis, bent to one knee and bowed his head. The boy touched the leathery, vulnerable flesh of his neck with wonder. Rise, bondsman, in love. Cord stood slowly, and there might have been pain behind the impassive mask of his resumed features. This is waste. Cry off, you foolish boy. I break my oath. Cry off and wait. The boy said nothing. Very well. If you say so, let it be so. Cord's voice became dry and businesslike. 1 hour, and the weapon of your choice. You will bring your stick? I always have. How many sticks have you How many sticks have been taken from you, Cord? Which was tantamount to asking, how many boys have entered the square yard beyond the great hall and returned to Gunslinger apprentices? No stick will be taken from me today, Cord said slowly. I regret it. There is only the place, boy. There is only the once, boy. The penalty for over eagerness is the same as the penalty for unworthiness. Can you not wait? Okay. The boy recalled Martin standing over him, the smile, the sound of the blow from behind the closed doors. No. Very well. What weapon do you choose? The boy said nothing. Court's smile showed a jagged ring of teeth. Wise enough to begin. In an hour, you realize you will, in all probability, never see your father, your mother, or your car babies again. I know what exile means, Roland said softly. Go now. Meditate on your father's face. Much good it will do you. The boy went, without looking back. We're going to be at subchapter 6, page 176 of chapter 4. The cellar of the barn was sprousingly cool, dank, smelling of cobwebs and earth water. The sun lit in its dusty rays from narrow windows, but here was none of the day's heat. The boy kept the hawk here, and the birds seemed comfortably enough. David no longer hunted the sky. His feathers had lost radiant animal brightness of 3 years ago, but the eyes were still as piercing and motionless as ever. You cannot friend a hawk, they said, unless you are half a hawk yourself, alone, and only a sojourner in the land, without friends or the need of them. The hawk pays no coinage to love or morals. David was an old hawk now. The boy hoped that he himself was the young one. Hi, he said, softly extended his arm to the tethering perch. The hawk stepped onto the boy's arm and stood motionless, unhooded. With his other hand, the boy reached into his pocket and fished out a bit of dried jerky. The hawk snapped it defiantly from between his fingers and made it disappear. The boy began to stroke David very carefully. Court most probably would not have believed if he had seen it, but Court did not believe the boy's time had come either. I think you die today, he said, continuing to stroke. I think you will be made a sacrifice, like all of those little birds were trained you on. Do you remember? No, it doesn't matter. After today, I am the hawk. Each year on the day, I will shoot the sky in your memory. David stood on his arm, silent and unblinking, indifferent to his life or death. You are the old, the boy said reflectively, and perhaps not my friend. Even a year ago, would you have had my eyes instead of that little string of meat, and isn't it so? Court made Court would laugh. But if we get close enough to that Chevre man, if he doesn't suspect it, which will it be, David? Age or friendship? David did not say. The boy hooded him and found the jesses, which were looped at the end of the David's perch. They left the barn. We're going to be in subchapter 7 of chapter 4, page 177. Give me 1 second, a full good minute. Okay, a little less than that. Subchapter 7, Chapter 4, page 177. The yard behind the Great Hall was not really a yard at all, but only a green corridor whose walls were formed by tangled thick-grown hedges. It had been used for the rite of coming of age since time out of mind, long before Court and his predecessors, Mark, who had died of a stab wound from an overzealous hand in this palace. Many boys had left the corridor from the east end, where the teachers always entered as men. The east end faced the great hall and all the civilization and the intrigue of the lighted world. Many more had slunk away, beaten and bloody, from the west end, where the boys always entered as boys forever. The west end faced the farms and the hot dwellers beyond the farms. Beyond that, the tangled barbarian forest. Beyond that, Garland, and beyond Garland, the Mohane desert. The boy who became a man progressed from darkness, unlearning, to light and responsibility. The boy who was beaten could only retreat forever and forever. The hallway was as smooth and green as a gaming field. Ooh, 1 second. It was exactly 50 yards long, in the middle of a swatch of shaven earth. That was the line. Each end was usually clogged with tense spectators and relatives, for the ritual was usually forecast with great accuracy. 18 was the most common age. Those who had not made their test by the age of 25 usually slipped into obscurity as freeholders, unable to face the brutality, all or nothing fact of the field and the test. But on this day, there were none but Jamie de Curry, Cuthbert Algood, Elaine Johns, and Thomas Whitman. They clustered as the boys' end, gape-mouthed and frankly terrified. "You weapon, stupid!" Cuthbert hissed in an agony. You forgot your weapon." "I have it," the boy said. Dimly he wondered if the news of this lunacy had reached yet to the central buildings, to his mother, and to Martin. His father was on a hunt, not due back for days. In this he felt a sense of shame. He felt that it, he felt that in his father he would have found understanding, if not approval. "Has Court come?" "Court is here." The voice came from the far end of the corridor, and Court stepped into the view, dressed as a short singlet. A, heather, a heavy leather band encircled his forehead to keep sweat from his eyes. He wore a dirty girdle to hold his back straight. He held an ironwood stick in one hand, sharp on one end, heavily blunted and spatulate on the other. He began the litany which all of them, chosen by the blind blood of their fathers all the way back to the eld, had known since early childhood, leaned against the day, learned against the day, when they would perchance become men. "Have you come for serious purpose, boy?" "I have come for a serious purpose." "Have you come as an outcast from your father's house?" "I have so, and would remain outcast until he had bested Court. If Court bested him, he would remain outcast forever." "Have you come with your chosen weapon?" "I have." "What is your weapon?" This was the teacher's advantage, his chance to adjust the plan of battle to the sling or spear or bow or bow. "My weapon is David." Court halted, only briefly. He was surprised and very likely confused. That was good. Might be good. "So then have you at me, boy?" "I do." In whose name?" "In the name of my father." "Say his name." "Stephen Deshane, of the line of Eld." "Be swift then." And Court advanced into the corridor, switching his stick from one hand to the other. The boys signed flutteringly, like birds, as their dindans stepped to meet him. "His weapon is David, teacher." Did Court understand? If so, did he understand fully? If he did, very likely all was lost. It turned on surprise, and on whatever stuff the hawk had left in him. Would he only sit, disinterested and stupid, on the boy's arm, while Court struck him brainlessly with the ironwood, or seek escape in the high, hot sky? As they drove closer together, each of the notes still on the side of the line. The boy loosened the hawk's hood with nerveless fingers. It dropped to the green grass, and Court halted in his tracks. He saw the old warrior's eyes drop to the bird and widen with surprise and slow dawning comprehension. Now he understood. "Oh, you little fool!" Cord nearly groaned, and Roland was suddenly furious that he should be spoken to so. "At him!" cried, raising his arm, and David flew like a silent brown bullet, stubbing wings, pumping once, twice, three times before crashing into Cort's face, talons searching, beak digging. Red drops flew up into the hot hair. "Heil, Roland!" Cuthbert screamed, deliriously. "First blood! First blood to my bosom!" He struck to his chest hard enough to leave a bruise there that would not fade for a week. Court staggered backwards, off balance. The ironwood staff rose and beat furiously at the air about his head. The hawk was an undilated, blurred bundle of feathers. The boy, meanwhile, arrowed forward, his hand held out in a straight wedge, his elbow locked. This was his first chance. This was his chance, and very likely the only one he'd have. Steel Court was almost too quick for him. The bird had covered 90% of his vision, but the ironwood came up again, spatulated in forward, and Court cold-bloodedly performed the only action that could turn events at this point. He beat his own face 3 times, biceps flexing mercilessly. David flew away, broken and twisted. One wing flapped frantically at the ground. His cold predator's eyes stared fiercely into his teacher's bloody, streaming face. Court's bad eye now bulged blindly from its socket. Yeah. The boy delivered a kick to Court's temple, connecting solidly. It should have ended it, but it did not. For a moment, Court's face went slack, and then he lunged, grabbing for the boy's foot. The boy skipped back and tripped over his own feet. He went down a sprawl. He heard from afar the sound of Jamie screaming in dismay. Court was ready to fall on him and finish him. Roland had lost his advantage, and both of them knew it. For a moment, they looked at each other, and the teacher standing over the pupil with the gouts of blood pouring from the left side of his face. The bad eye, now closed except for a thin slit of white. There would be no brothels for Court this night. Something ripped jaggedly at the boy's hand. It was David, tearing blindly at whatever he could reach. Both wings were broken. It was incredible that he still lived. The boy grabbed him like a stone, unmindful of the jabbing, diving beak that was taking the flesh from his wrist in ribbons. As Court flew at him, all spread-eagled, the boy threw the hawk upward. "Heil, David! Kill!" And then Court blotted out the sun, and came down on top of him. Subchapter 8, page 181 of Chapter 4. The bird was smashed between them, and the boy felt calloused thumb probe for the socket of his eye. He turned it, and at the same time bringing up the slab of his thigh to block Court's crouch-seeking knee. His own hand flailed against the tree of Court's neck in 3 hard chops. It was like hitting ribstone. Then Court made a thick grunting. His body shuddered. Faintly, the boy saw one hand flailing for the drop stick, and with a jackknifing lunge, he kicked it out of reach. David had hooked one talon into Court's right ear. The other battered mercilessly at the teacher's cheek, making it ruin. Warm blood splattered the boy's copper. Warm blood splattered the boy's face, smelling of smeared copper. Court's fist struck the bird once, breaking his back. Again, the neck snapped away at a crooked angle. Still the talon clutched. There was no ear now. Only a red hole tunneled into the side of Court's skull. The third blow sent the bird flying, at last clearing Court's face. The moment it was clear, the boy brought the edge of his hand across the bridge of his teacher's nose, using every bit of his strength and breaking his thin bone. Blood sprayed. Court grasped. Unseeing hand ripped at the boy's buttocks, trying to pull his trousers down, trying to hobble him. Roland rolled away, found Court's stick, and rose to his knees. Court came to his own knees, grim, Incredibly, they faced each other the way from either side of the line. Although they had switched positions, Court was now on the other side where Roland had begun the contest. The old warrior's face was curtained with gore. The one seeing eye rolled fearlessly in his socket. The nose was smashed over to a haunted, leaning angle. Both cheeks hung in its flaps. The boy held the man's stick like a grim points player waiting for the pitch of the rawhide bird. Cord double fainted and then came directly at him. Roland was ready, not fooled in the slightest by this last trick, which both knew was a poor one. The ironwood swung in a flat arc, striking Court's scroll with a dull, thudded noise. Court fell on his side, looking at the boy with a lazy, unseeing expression. A thin trickle of spit came from his mouth. "Yield or die," the boy said. The mouth was filled with wet cotton. Court smiled. Nearly all consciousness was gone, and he would remain tended in his cottage for a week afterward, wrapped in the blackness of a coma. But now he held on with all strength of his pitiless, shadowless life. He saw the need to palaver in the boy's eyes, and even with a curtain of blood between the two of them, understood that the need was desperate. "I yield, gunslinger. I yield smiling. You have the day remembered the face of your father and all those who came before him. What a wonder you have done." Court's clear eye closed. The gunslingers shook him gently, but with persistence. The others were around him, their hands trembling to thump his back and hoist him to their shoulders, but they held back, afraid, sensing a new gulf. Yet there was not as strange as it could have been. Besides, there had always been a gulf between this one and the rest. Court's eyes rolled open again. "The key," the gunslinger said. "My birthright. Teacher, I need it." His birthright were his guns, not the heavy ones of his father, weighted with sandalwood, but guns all the same, forbidden to all but a few. In the heavy vault under the barracks where he had been, ancient law was now required to abide. Away from his mother's breast hung his apprentice weapons, heavy, cumbersome barrel shooters of steel and nickel. Yet they seen his father through his apprenticeships. His father now ruled at least in name. "Is your name so murdered? Oop. Is your name so fearsome then?" Corp muttered as if in his sleep. "So pressing. I fear so. So much need should have made you stupid. And yet you won. The key. The hawk was a fine ploy, a fine weapon. How long did it take you to train that bastard?" "I never trained David. I friended him. The key. Under my belt. Gunslinger." The eye closed again. The gunslinger reached under Court's belt, feeling the heavy press of the man's belly. The huge muscle there now slack and asleep. The key was on a brass ring. He clutched it in his hand, restraining the mad urge to thrust it up into the sky in a salutation of victory. He got to his feet and was finally turning to the others when Court's hand fumbled for his foot. For a moment, the gunslinger feared some last attack and tensed, but Court only looked up at him and beckoned with one crusted finger. "I'm going to sleep now," Court whispered calmly. I'm going to walk the path, perhaps all the way to the clearing. At the end of it, I don't know. I teach you no more, gunslinger. You have surpassed me. 2 years younger than your father, who was the youngest. But let me counsel." "What?" Impatiently. "Wipe that look off your face, maggot." In his surprise, Roland did as he was bid, although being crouched hidden behind his face, as well all are, could not know it. Cord nodded and then whispered a single word. "Wait." "What?" The effort it took the man to speak lent his words great emphasis. "Let the word and the legend go before you. There are those who will carry both." His eyes flickered over the gunslinger's shoulders. "Fools, perhaps. Let your shadow grow hair on its face. Let it become dark. He smiled grotesquely. Given time, words may even enchant an enchanter. Do you take my meaning, gunslinger? Yes, I think I do. Will you take my last counsel as your teacher? The gunslinger rocked back on his heels, a hunkering, thicking posture that foreshadowed the man. He looked at the sky. It was deep in purpling. The heat of the day was falling, and thunderheads in the west foretold rain. Lightning thines jabbed the pallid flank of the rising foothills miles distant. Beyond that, the mountains. Beyond that, the rising fountains of blood and unreason. He was tired, tired into his bones and beyond. He looked back at Cord. I will bury my hawk tonight, teacher, and later go into Lower Town to inform those in the brothels that will wonder about you. Perhaps I will comfort one or two a little. Quart's lips parted in a painted smile, and then he slept. The gunslinger got to his feet and turned to the others. Make a litter. Take them to his house. Then bring a nurse. No, two nurses. Okay? They still watched him, caught in a baited moment that none of them could immediately break. They still looked for a cornea of fire, a magical change of features. Two nurses, the gunslinger repeated, and then smiled. They smiled in return, nervously. You goddamn horse drover, Cuthbert suddenly yelled, grinning. You hadn't left enough meat for the rest of us to pick off the bone. The world won't move on tomorrow, the gunslinger said, quoting the old adage with a smile. Elaine, you butterbutt, move your freight. Alan set about the business of making the litter. Thomas and Jamie went together to the main hall at the infirmary. The gunslinger and Cuthbert looked at each other. They had always been the closest, or as close as they could under the particular shades of their characters. There was a speculative, open light in Bert's eyes, and the gunslinger controlled only with great difficulty the need to tell him not to call for the test for a year or even 18 months, lest he go west. But they had been through a great ordeal together, and the gunslinger did not feel he could risk saying such a thing without a look on his face that might be taken for arrogance. I had begun to scheme, he thought, and was a little dismayed. He thought of Martin, of his mother, and he smiled a deceiver's smile at his friend. I am to be the first, he thought, knowing it was the first time, although he had thought of it idly many times before. I am the first. Let's go, he said. With pleasure, gunslinger. They left by the east end of the hedge-bordered corridor. Thomas and Jamie were returning with the nurses already. They looked like ghosts in their white and gauzy summer robes, crossed at the breast with red. Shall I help you with the hawk? Cuthbert asked. Yes, the gunslinger said. That would be lovely, Bert. And later, when darkness had come and rushing thunder showers with it, while huge phantom chasms rolled across the sky, lighting washed the crooked streets of the lower town in the blue fire, while horses stood at hitching rails with their heads down and their tails drooping, the gunslinger took a woman and lay with her. It was quick and good. When it was over, and they lay side by side without speaking, it began to hail with a brief, rattling ferocity. Downstairs and far away, someone was playing Hey Jude ragtime. The gunslinger's mind turned reflectively inward. It was in this hail splattered silence, just before sleep overtook him, that he thought he might also be the last. We're going to be at subchapter 9. I'm going to take a good 2-minute break here, a good 2-minute break. I'll be right back. Thank y'all. Thanks, Trev. Thanks, Robin. It does count. I mean, if you like the story, you know. All right, so we're on chapter 4, subchapter 9, page 187. Um, I'm chilling too. All right, hey, Biz and Lusker, thanks to all y'all. I really hope y'all are enjoying this, you know. Um, all right, let's get back into it. The gunslinger didn't tell the boy all of this, but perhaps most of it came through anyway. He had already realized that this was an extreme, perceptive boy, not so different from Elaine, who was strong in the half empathy, half telepathy they called the touch. You asleep? The gunslinger asked. No. Did you understand what I told you? Understand it? The boy asked with surprising scorn. Understand it? Are you kidding? No. The gunslinger felt defensive. He had never told anyone about this coming of age before because he felt abrasively about it. Of course, the hawk had been a perfectly acceptable weapon, yet it had been a trick too, and a betrayal, the first of many. And tell me, am I really preparing to throw this boy at the man in black? I understood it all. I understood it. All right, the boy said. It was a game, wasn't it? Do grown men always have to play games? Does everything have to be an excuse for another kind of game? Do any men grow up, or do they only come of age? You don't know everything, the gunslinger said, trying to hold his slow anger. You're just a boy. Sure, but I know what I am to you. And what is that? The gunslinger asked tightly. A poker chip. The gunslinger felt an urge to find a rock and brain the boy. Instead, he spoke calmly. Go to sleep. Boys need their sleep. And in his mind, he heard Martin's echo. Go and find your hand. He sat stiffly in the darkness, stunning with horror and terrified. For the first time in his existence of the self-loathing that might come afterward. We're at chapter 4, subchapter 10, page 188. During the next period of waking, the railroad uh, angled closer to the underground river and they came upon the slow mutants. Jake saw the first one and screamed aloud. The gunslinger's head, which had been fixed straight forward as he pumped, the handcar jerked to the right. There was a rotten jack-o'-lantern's green mist below them, pulsating faintly. For the first time he became aware of odor, faint, unpleasant, and wet. Hold on one second. The greenness was a face, what might be called a face by one of a charitable bent. Above the flattened nose was an insectile node of eyes, peering at them expressionlessly. The gunslinger felt an ophistic crawl in his intestines and privates. He stepped up, the rhythm of arms and the handcar handled slightly. The glowing faces faded. What the hell is that? The boy asked, crawling to him. What? The words stopped dumb in the throat as they came up and then past a group of three faintly growing forms, standing between the rails and the invisible river, watching them, motionless. They're slow mutants, the gunslinger said. I don't think they'll bother us. They're probably just as frightened of us as we are of... One of the forms broke free and shambled toward them. The face was that of a starving idiot. The faint, naked body had been transformed into a nodding mess of tentacular limbs and suckers. The boy screamed again and crowded against the gunslinger's leg like a frightened dog. One of the thing's tentacled arms pawned across the flat platform of the handcar. It reeked of the wet and the dark. The gunslinger let loose of the handle and drew. He put a bullet through the forehead of the starving idiot face. It fell away, the faint swamp fire glow fading and eclipsed moon. The gun flash lay bright and branded on their dark redness, fading only reluctantly. The smell of expended powder was hot and savage and alien in this buried place. There were others, more of them. None moved against them overtly, but they were closing in on the tracks, a silent, hideous party of rubberneckers. You may have to pump for me, the gunslinger said. Can you? Yeah. Then be ready. The boy stood close to him, his body poised. His eyes took in the slow mutants only as they passed, not traversing, not seeing more than they had to. The boy assumed a psychic bulge of terror, as if the very id had somehow sprung out through his pores to form a shield. If he had the touch, the gunslinger reasoned that was not impossible. The gunslinger pumped steadily, but did not increase his speed. The slow mutants could smell their terror. He knew that, and he doubted if the terror alone would be enough to motivate them. He and the boy were, after all, the creatures of the light and the whole. How they must hate us, he thought, and wondered if they had hated the man in black in the same way. He thought not. Or perhaps he had passed among them only like the shadow of a dark wing in the greatest darkness. The boy made a noise in his throat, and the gunslinger turned his head almost casually. Four of them were charging the handcar in a stumbling way, one of them in the process of finding a hand grip. The gunslinger let go of the handle and drew again, with the same sleepy, casual motion. He shot the lead mutant in the head. The mutant made a sighing, sobbing noise and began to grin. Its hands went limp and fish-like, dead. The fingers clove to one another like the fingers of a glove long immersed in a dying mud. One of the corp hands found the boy's foot and began to pull. The boy shrieked aloud, and the granite wound. The gunslinger shot the mutant in the chest. It began to slobber through the grin. Jake was going off the side. The gunslinger caught one of his arms and almost pulled off balance himself. The thing was surprisingly strong. The gunslinger put another bullet in the mutant's head. One eye went out like a candle. Still it pulled. They engaged in a silent tug of war for Jake's jerking, wriggling body. The slow mutant yanked on him like a wishbone. The wish would undoubtedly be to dine. The handcar was slowing down. The others began to close in. The lame, the halt, the blind. Perhaps they only looked for a Jesus to heal them, to raise them Lazarus-like from the darkness. It's the end for the boy, the gunslinger thought with perfect coldness. This is the end he meant. Let go and pump, or hold on and be buried. The end for the boy. He gave a tremendous yank on the boy's arm and shot the mutant in the belly. For one frozen moment, its grip grew even tighter, and Jake began to slide off his edge again. Then the dead mud mitts loosened, and the slow mutie fell off on its face behind the slow handcar, still fucking grinning. I thought you'd leave me, the boy was sobbing. I thought, hold on to my belt, the gunslinger said. Hold on, and just as tight as you can. The hand worked into his belt and clutched there. The boy was breathing in great convulsion, silent gasps. The gunslinger began to pump steadily again, and the handcar picked up speed. The slow mutants fell back a step and watched them go with faces hardly human, or pathetically so. Faces that generated the weak phosphorescent common to those weird deep sea fishes that lived under incredibly black pressure, faces that held no anger or hate, but only what seemed to be semi-conscious idiot regret. They're thinning, the gunslinger said. They're drawing up muscles of the lower belly privates and relaxed a small bit. They're The slow mutants had put rocks across the tracks. The way was blocked. It had been a quick, poor job, perhaps the work of only a minute to clear, but they were stopped, and someone would have to get down and move them. The boy moaned and shuddered closely to the gunslinger. The gunslinger let go of the handle, and the handcar coasted noiselessly to the rocks, where it thumped to rest. The slow mutants began to close in again, almost casually, almost if they had been passing by, lost in a dream of darkness, and they had found someone of whom to ask directions. A street corner congregation of the damned beneath the ancient rock. Are they going to get us? The boy asked calmly. Never in life. Be quiet a second. He looked at the rocks. The mutants were weak, of course, and had not been able to drag any of the boulders to block Their way, only small rocks, only enough to stop them, to make someone get down, the gunslinger said. You'll have to move them. I'll cover you. No, the boy pleaded. No, the boy whispered. Please. I can't give you a gun, and I can't move the rocks. Shoot too. You have to get down. Jake's eyes rolled terribly. For a moment his body shuddered in tune with the tunings of his mind, and then he wriggled over to the side, began to throw rocks to the right and to the left, working with mad speed, not looking up. The gunslinger drew and waited. Two of them lurched rather than walked, went for the boy with arms like dough. The guns did their work, stitching the darkness with red-white lances of light that pushed needles of pain into the gunslinger's eyes. The boy screamed and continued to throw away rocks to either side, which glow leapt and danced. Hard to see now, that was the worst. Everything had gone to shadows and after images. One of them, glowing hardly at all, suddenly reached for the boy with rubber boogeyman arms. Eyes that ate up half the mutant's head rolled wetly. Jake screamed again and turned to struggle. The gunslinger fired without allowing himself to think. Before his spotty vision could betray his hands into a terrible quiver, the two heads were only inches apart. It was the mutie who fell. Jake threw rocks wildly. The mutants milled just outside the invisible line of trespass, closing a little at a time, now very close. Others had caught up, swelling their number. All right, the gunslinger said. Get on, quick. When the boy moved, the mutants came at them. Jake, over the side, scrambling to his feet. The gunslinger was already pumping again, all out. Both guns were holstered now. They must run. It was their only chance. 1 second. Strain's hands slapped the metal plane of the car's surface. The boy was holding his belt with both hands now, his face pressed tightly into the small of the gunslinger's back. A group of them ran onto the tracks, their faces full of that mindless, casual anticipation. The gunslinger was full of adrenaline. The car was flying along the tracks into the darkness. They struck the 4 or 5 pitiful hulks full force. They flew like rotten bananas, struck from the stem. One by one and on and on into the soundless, flying banshee darkness. After an age, the boy raised his face into the Made wind, dreading and yet needing to know, the ghost of gun flashes still lingering on his retinas. There was nothing to see but the darkness, and nothing to hear but the rumble of the river. They're gone, the boy said, suddenly fearing an end to the tracks in the darkness, and the wounding crash as they jumped the rails and plunged to the twisted ruin. He had ridden in cars once, and his humorless father had driven at 90 on the New Jersey Turnpike, and he had been stopped by a cop who ignored the 20 Elmer Chambers offered with his license and gave him a ticket anyway. But he had never ridden like this, with the wind and the blindness and the terrors behind and ahead, with the sound of the river like a chuckling voice, the voice of the man in black. The gunslinger's arms were pistons like a lunatic human factory. They're gone, the boy said timidly, the words ripped from his mouth by the wind. You can slow down now. We left them behind. The gunslinger did not hear. They careened onward onto the strange dark. It's going to be subchapter 11 of chapter 4, page 194. They went on for 3 days without incident. Subchapter 12 of chapter 4, page 194. During the fourth period of waking, halfway through 3/4, they didn't know. Knew only that they weren't tired enough yet to stop. There was a sharp thud beneath them. The handcar swayed, and the bodies immediately leaned to the right against the gravity as the rails took a gradually turn to the left. There was a light ahead, a glow so faint and alien that it seemed at first to be totally new element. Not earth, air, fire, nor water. It had no color and could only be discerned by the fact that it had regained their hands and faces in a dimension beyond that of touch. Their eyes had become so light sensitive that they noticed the glow more than 5 miles before they approached its source. The inn, the boy said tightly. It's the inn. No, The gunslinger spoke with odd assurance. It isn't. And it was not. They reached light, but not day. They had approached the source of the glow. They saw for the first time that the rock wall to the left had fallen away and the tracks had been joined by others which crossed in a complex spiderweb. The light laid them in burnished vectors. On some of them they were dark boxcars, passenger coaches, and a stage that had been adapted to rails. They made the gunslinger nervous, like ghost galleons trapped in an underground sargasso. The light grew stronger, hurting their eyes a little, but growing slowly enough to allow them to adapt. They came from dark to light like divers coming up from deep fathoms in slow stages. Along, drawing near, was a huge hangar stretching up into the dark. Cut into it, showing yellow squares of light, were a series of perhaps 24 entrance ways, growing from the size of toy windows to the height of 20 feet as they drew closer. They passed inside through one of the middle ways. Written above were a series of characters in various languages. The gunslinger presumed. He was astounded to find that he could read the last one. It was an ancient root of the high speech itself and said, Track 10 to surface and points west. The light inside was brighter. The tracks met and merged through a series of switchings. Here, some of the traffic lanterns still worked, flashing internally reds and greens and embers. They rolled between the rising stone piers, caked black with the passage of thousands of vehicles, and then there was in some kind of central terminal. The gunslinger let the handcar coast slowly to a stop, and they peered around. It's like a subway, the boy said. Subway? Never mind. You wouldn't know what I was talking about. I don't even know what I'm talking about. Not anymore. The boy climbed up to the cracked cement. They looked at silent, deserted booths where newspapers and books had once been traded or sold. A bouterie, a weapon shop. The gunslinger, suddenly feverishing with excitement, saw revolvers and rifles. Closer inspection showed that the barrels had been filled with lead. He did, however, pick out a bow, which he slung over his back, and a quiver of almost useless, badly weighted arrows. A women's apparel shop. Somewhere a converter was turning the air over and over, as it had for thousands of years, but perhaps would not for much longer. It had a granting noises somewhere in its cycles, which served to remind the perpetual motion, even under strictly controlled conditions, was still a fool's dream. The air had a mechanical taste. Was it mechanical? The air had a mechanized taste. The boy's shoes and the gunslinger's boots made flat echoes. The boy cried out, Hey, hey! The gunslinger turned around and went to him. The boy was standing transfixed at the bookstall. Inside, sprawling in the far corner, was a mummy. It was wearing a blue uniform with a gold piping. A trainman's uniform, by the look. There was an excitement, perfectly preserved. No. There was an ancient, perfectly preserved newspaper on the dead thing's lap, and it was crumbled to dust when the gunslinger touched it. The mummy's face was like an old shriveled apple. Cautiously, the gunslinger touched the cheek. There was a small puff of dust. When it cleared, they were able to look through the flesh and into the mummy's mouth. A gold tooth twinkled there. Gas, the gunslinger murmured. The old people made a gas that would do this, or so Vanny told us. The one who taught you from books? Yeah, he. I bet these old people fought wars with it, the boy said, darkly. Killed other old people with it? I'm sure you're right. There were perhaps a dozen other mummies, all but 2 or 3 wearing the blue and gold ornament uniforms. The gunslinger supposed that the gas had been used when the place was empty and most incoming and outgoing traffic. Perhaps once, in the dim ago, the station had been a military objective of some long-gone army and cause. The thought depressed him. We better go on, he said, and started towards track 10, the handcar again. But the boy stood rebelliously behind him. Not going. The gunslinger turned back, surprised. The boy's face was twisted and trembling. You won't get what you want until I'm dead. I'll take my chances by myself. The gunslinger nodded non-committally, hating himself for what he was going to do. Oh, okay, Jake, he said mildly. Long days, pleasant nights. He turned around and walked across the stone piers, leaped easily down onto the handcar. You made a deal with someone, the boy screamed after him. I know you did. The gunslinger not replying carefully, but the bow in front of the tow post, the T-post rising out of the handcar's floor, out of harm's way. The boy's fists were clenched, his features drawn in agony. How easily you bluffed this young boy, the gunslinger told himself. Again and again, his wonderful intuition, his touch, his led him to this point, and again, you have led him on past it. How difficult could it be? After all, he has no friends but you. In a sudden, simple thought, almost a vision, it came to him that all he had to do was give it over, turn around, take the boy with him, make him the center of a new force. The tower did not have to be obtained in the humiliating, nose-rubbing way, did it? Let the quest resume after the boy had grown of years, when the two of them could ease when the two of them could cast the man of black aside like a cheap wind-up toy. Surely, he thought, cynically, surely. He knew with sudden coldness that turning backward would mean death for both of them. Death or worse, entombment with the slow mutants behind them, decay of all the facilities, with perhaps the guns of his father living long enough after both of them, kept in rotten splendor as totems not unlike that unforgotten gas pump. Some show guts, he told himself falsely. He reached for the handle and began to pump it. The handcar moved away from the stone piers. The boy screamed, Wait! And began running on the diagonal toward where the handcar would emerge near the darkness ahead. The gunslinger had an impulse to speed up, to leave the boy alone, yet at least with an uncertainty. Instead, he caught up as he leapt. Instead, he caught him as he leapt. The heart beneath the thin shirt thrummed and fluttered as Jake clung to him. The end was very close now. We're going to be at subchapter 13 of chapter 4, page 198. I'm going to take like a 1 to 2 minute break. I'll be right back. Okay. We're getting really close to the end, let me tell y'all. Um, we're at 198, and I think it's like 240 is the where it ends. Trying to get my eye, like after a while, I read so much, my eyes start like merging stuff together. You kind of hear it near the end before I take a break, but that's kind of what I'm doing is giving my eye the rest it needs. So I'll go like cross-eyed, I'll be like, eh. All right. We are at chapter 4, subchapter 13, page 198. The sound of the river had become very loud, filling even the dreams with its thunder. The gunslinger, more as a whim than anything else, let the boy pump them ahead while he shot a number of bad arrows, tethered by fine white links of thread into the dark. The bow was also very bad, incredibly preserved, but with a terrible pull and aim despite that. 1 second. Yeah, I'm trying not to go crazy. All right. The bow was also very bad, increasingly preserved, but with a terrible pull and aim despite that. The gunslinger knew nothing would improve it. Even restringing it would not help the tired wood. The arrows would not fly far into the dark, but the last one he sent out came back wet and slick. The gunslinger only shrugged when the boy asked him how far to the water, but privately he didn't think the arrow could have traveled more than 60 yards from the rotted bow, and lucky to get that far. Still, the river's thunder grew louder and closer. During the third waking period after the station, a spectral radiance began to grow again. They had entered a long tunnel of some weird phosphorescent rock, and the wet walls glittered and twinkled in thousands of miniature starbursts. The boy called them fossils. They say things in a kind of they saw things in a kind of eerie horror house sterility. The brute sound of the river was channeled to them by the confining rock, magnified in its own natural amplifier. Yet the sound remained oddly constant. Even as they approached the crossing point, the gunslinger was sure lay ahead. Beside, because the walls were widening, drawing back, the angle of their ascent became more pronounced. The tracks arrowed through the new light. To the gunslinger, the clumps of fossils looked like the captive tubes of swamp gas, sometimes sold by for a pretty at the feast of Reap, Reap Tide Fair. To the boy, they looked like endless streamers of neon tubing. But in its glow, they could both see that the rock that enclosed them so long ended up ahead in ragged twin peninsulas that pointed toward a gulf of darkness, the chasm over the river. The tracks continued out and over the unknown knowable drop, supported by a trestle eons old, and beyond what seemed an incredible distance was a tiny pinprick of light, not phosphorescent or fluorescent, but the hard, true light of day. It was a tiny, it was as tiny as a needle prick in its dark cloth, yet weighted with frightful meaning. Stop, the boy said. Stop for a minute, please. Unquestioning, the gunslinger let the handcar coast to a stop. The sound of the river was steady, booming roar coming from beneath and ahead. The artificial glow from the wet rock was suddenly hateful. For the first time, he felt a claustrophobic hand touch him, and the urge to get out, to get free of this living burial was strong and nearly undeniable. We'll go on, the boy said. Is that what he wants? For us to drive the handcar out over that and fall down? The gunslinger knew it was not, but said, I don't know what he wants. He got down and approached the lip of the drop carefully. The stone beneath the feet continued to rise until, with a sudden angling drop, the floor fell away from the tracks and the tracks continued alone across blackness. The gunslinger dropped to his knees, peered down. He could dimly make out a complex, nearly incredible webwork of steel girders and struts disappearing down toward the roar of the river, all in support of the graceful arch of the tracks across the void. In his mind's eye, he could imagine the work of time and water on the steel, in deadly tandem. How much support was left? Little, hardly, any, none? He suddenly saw the face of the mummy again, and the way the flesh, seemingly solid, had crumbled to powder at the effortless touch of his finger. We'll walk now, the gunslinger said. He half expected the boy to balk again. He had preceded the gunslinger out onto the rails, crossing on the welded steel slats calmly, with sure feet. The gunslinger followed him over the chasm, ready to catch him if Jake should put a foot wrong. The gunslinger felt a fine slick of sweat covering his skin. The trestle was rotten, very rotten. It thrummed beneath his feet with the heavy motion of the river far beneath, swaying a little on unseen guy wires. We're acrobats, he thought. Look, mother, no net. I'm flying. He knelt once and examined the cross ties that they were walking on. They were caked and pitted with rust. He could feel the reason on his face. Fresh air, the friend of corruption. They must be very close to the surface now, and a strong blow of the fist made the water quiver sickly. Once he heard a warning groan beneath his feet and felt the steel settle pre preparatory to giving way. He had already moved on. The boy, of course, was over 100 pounds lighter and safe enough unless the going became progressively worse. Behind them, the handcar had melted into a general bloom. The stone pier on the left extended out perhaps 20 yards. It jutted further than the one on the right, but this was also left behind, and they were alone over the gulf. At first it seemed a tiny prick of daylight, remaining mockingly constant, perhaps even drawing away from them at the exact pace they approached it. That would be a fine bit of magic indeed. But gradually the gunslinger realized that it was widening, becoming more defined. They were still below it, but the tracks were rising to meet it. What's up, Biggie? The boy gave a surprised grunt, suddenly lurched to the side, arms pinwheeling in slow, wide revolutions. It seemed that he tottered on the brink of a very long time indeed before stepping forward again. It almost went on me, he said softly, without emotion. There's a hole. Step over it if you don't want to take a quick trip to the bottom. Simon says, take one giant step. That was a game, the gunslinger knew his mother says. He remembered well childhood games with Cuthbert, Jamie, and Elaine, but he said nothing, only stepped over it. Go back, Jake said unsmilingly. You forgot to say, may I? Cry your pardon, but I think not. The cross-tie the boy had stepped on had given away almost entirely and flopped downward lazily, swinging on a rotten rivet. Upward, still upward. It was a nightmare walk, and so seemed to go on much longer than it did. The air itself seemed to thicken and become like taffy. The gunslinger felt as if he might be swimming rather than walking. Again and again his mind tried to turn itself to thoughtful, lunatic consideration of the awful space between the trestle and the river below. His brain viewed it in a spectacular detail, and how it would be. The scream of twisting, giving metal, the lurch as his body slid off the side, the grabbing of the non-existential handholds with his fingers, the swift rattle of boot heels on treacherous rotten steel, and then down, turning over and over, the warm spray in the crotch as the bladder let go, the rush of wind against his face, rippling his hair up in caricature fright, pulling his eyelids back, the dark water rushing to meet him, faster, overstripping even his own scream. Metal screamed beneath him, but he stepped past it unhurriedly, shifting his weight at that crucial moment, not thinking of the drop, or how far they had come, or how far might be left, not thinking that the boy was expendable, and that the sale of his honor was now at last nearly negated. What a relief it would be when the deal was done. Three ties out, the boy said coolly. I'm gonna jump. Here, right here. Geronimo! The gunslinger saw silhouetted for a moment against the daylight, an awkward, hunched spread eagle, arms out as if, should all else fail, there was the possibility of flight. He landed, and the whole edifice swayed drunkenly under his weight. Metal beneath that protested, and something far below fell, first with a crash, then with a splash. Are you over? The gunslinger asked. Yar, the boy said. But it's not rotten. Like the idea of certain people. Maybe. I don't think it will hold you until any further than where you are now. Me, but not you. Go back. Go back now. Leave me alone. His voice was cold, but there was hysteria underneath it, beating at his heart and had beat when he jumped back onto the handcar and Roland had caught him. The gunslinger stepped over the brake. One large step did it. One giant step. Mother, may I? Yes, you may. The boy shuddered helplessly. Go back. I don't want you to kill me. For the love of the man Jesus, walk, the gunslinger said roughly. I'm going to fall down for sure if we stand here palavering. The boy walked drunkenly now, his hands held out shuddering before him, fingers splayed. They went up. Yes, it was much more rotten now. There were frequent breaks of one, two, even three ties, and the gunslinger expected again and again that they would find a long, empty space between the rails that would either force them back or make them walk on the rails themselves, balancing guiltily over the chasm. He felt his eyes fixed on the daylight. The glow had taken on a color, blue, and as it came closer, it became softer, paler in the radiance of the foot soles. 50 yards or 100 still to cover, he could not say. They walked, and now he looked at his feet crossing from tie to tie. When he looked up again, the glow ahead had grown to a hole, and was not just light, but a way out. They were almost there. 30 yards now. No, more than that. 90 short feet. It could be done. Perhaps they would have the man in black yet. Perhaps the bright sunlight, the evil flowers in his mind, would shrivel and anything would be possible. The sunlight was blocked out. He looked up, startled, peered like a mole from its hole, and saw a silhouette filling the light, eating it up, allowing only chinks of mockering blue around the outline and shoulders on the fork of a crotch. Hello, boys. The man in black's voice echoed to them, amplifying in this natural throat of stone the sarcasm of a good cheer taking on mighty overtones. Blindly, the gunslinger sought the jawbone, but it was gone, lost somewhere, used up. He laughed above them, and the sound crashed around them, reverberating like surf in a filling cave. The boy screamed and tottered, a windmill again, arms gyrating through the scant air. Metal ripped and slawed beneath them. The rails canted through a slow and dreamy twisting. The boy plunged, and one hand flew up like a gull in the darkness, up and up, and then he hung over the pit, and he dangled there, his dark eyes staring up at the gunslinger in the final, blind, lost knowledge. Help me! Booming, racketing. No more games! Come on, gunslinger! Catch me never! All the chips were on the table, every card up but one. The boy dangled, a living tarot card, the hanged man, the Phoenician sailor, innocent lost, and barely above the wave of a Stygian sea. Wait then, wait a while. Do I go? His voice was so loud, it makes it hard to think. Help me! Help me, Roland! The trestle had begun to twist further, screaming, pulling, loose from itself, giving. I shall leave you. No, you shall not. The gunslinger's legs carried him in a sudden leap, breaking the paralysis that had held him. It took a true giant step above the dangling boy and led in a skidding, plunging rush towards the light that offered the tower frozen on his mind's eye in a black still life. Into sudden silence. The silhouette was gone. Even the beat of his heart was gone, as the trestle settled further, beginning its final slow dance to the depths, tearing loose, his hand finding the rocky, lighted lip of damnation. And behind him, in the dreadful silence, the boy spoke, far too far beneath him. Go then. There are many worlds than these. Or there are other worlds than these. Hey, Scotty. Then the trestle tore away, and the whole weight of it, and as the gunslinger pulled himself up and through to the light and the breeze and the reality of a new call, he twisted his head back for a moment in agony, striving to be honest. But there was nothing, only plummeting silence, for the boy made no cry as he fell. Then Roland was up, pulling himself onto the rocky escapement that looked toward a grassy plain, toward where the man in black stood spread-legged with arms crossed. The gunslinger stood drunkenly, pallid as a ghost, eyes huge and swimming beneath his forehead, shirt smeared with the white dust of his final lunging crawl. It came to him that there would be further degradations on the spirit ahead, and there might and that might make this one seem infinitesimal, and yet he would still flee it. Down corridors and through cities, from bed to bed, he would flee the boy's face and try to bury it in cunts and killing, only to enter one final room and find it looking at him over a candle flame. He had become the boy. The boy had become him. He had become a werewolf of his own making. In deep dreams, he would become the boy and speak the boy's strange city tongue. This is death, isn't it? Isn't it? He walked slowly, drunkenly down the rocky hill toward where the man in black waited. Here the tracks had been worn away, under the sun of reason. It was as if they had never been. The man in black pushed his head away with the backs of both hands, laughed. So, he cried, not an end, but an end of the beginning, eh? You progress, gunslinger. You progress. Oh, how I admire you. The gunslinger drew with blinding speed and fired 12 times. The gun flashes dimmed into the sun itself, and the pounding of the explosions slammed back from the rock face escarpments behind them. Now, the man in black said laughingly. Oh, now. We make great magic together, you and I. You kill me no more than you kill yourself. He withdrew, walking backwards, facing the gunslinger, grinning and beckoning. Come. Mother, may I? Yes, you may. The gunslinger followed him, in broken boots, to the palace of counseling. And that is going to be the end of chapter 4. We are at chapter 5, which is the gunslinger and the man in black. I'm actually going to stop the stream right here, but I'm going to finish this today, folks. I'm going to wait until after Trev does his stream, and then I will hop back on and I will finish the last 25 pages of the book, and that will be it. I hope everybody has enjoyed this as much as I have, doing the voices and everything. And I think I'm trying to stick to certain voices for certain people. So, I mean, if that's confusing, I hope it's not. But I've kind of selected how certain people sound, kind of thing. Roland's just me, though. That's just that. That's me. I'm the boy, and the boy is me. Okay, guys, that's all I got. I will be doing this later on this afternoon. I don't have a set time, but be looking forward. But I mean, this will be on the rewind as well. If you're not able to make the live, that's what this is for. I'm hoping people use this and listen to it and enjoy it, that kind of thing. All right, guys, I will see y'all later. Bye.